Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, we have quite a bit of news to cover today. A lot of unexpected stories, such as this news out of Israel, I would say. And then we have quite a bit of U.S. domestic news with the real regime crackdown, whether that be from the Trump arrest or the pending Restrict Act, if that goes through, or even the Douglas Mackey case, which many of us had forgotten about. It's one of those things that they really pushed down. And just the general state of America and the Anglosphere, I think, is going to be a pretty heavy topic for discussion later on in the show. So we'll have plenty of interesting stuff to cover. But as always, we will start with an update out of Ukraine, in which case I will hand it over to you.
Yes, hello everyone. Okay, so why don't we get into the battlefront news right away? As usual, I'll start with the southern front, and there's just artillery exchange as usual in the south, in the Kherson region. I didn't see any notable reports of Ukrainian drone attacks or anything like that. I have seen. Apparently, there was a depot that had exploded, and uh, people. This would be a munitions storage site, and people in Odessa might have seen it. So I don't know how big it is. Um, I did hear of another one that was destroyed in Kharkov. What's confusing is the video footage is the same footage, so I don't know which one is for what city. So take that with a big grain of salt. Stuff like this does happen, of course, right? Um, now, um, the reconnaissance with force attacks by the Ukrainians, as we continue to talk about the southern front, have ceased in the Zaporozhye region. There is, of course, talk of the big Ukrainian counteroffensive that is supposed to come in the spring. However, the last 2 days in a row, there's been snow. Fresh snow fell, I believe, on Friday and Thursday, and they are supposed to get snow in eastern Ukraine and southern Russia, like Taganrog, Rostov-na-Don, as well. So that would, I would imagine that can change planning to a certain degree. It depends on how much expediency is involved in this planning. In any case, not much has changed there. In the Ugledar area, the Russians have managed to recapture all of the Dakyas. So they're applying more and more pressure on the Ukrainians in Ugledar. Now, this has become an infamous place for the Russians, and no less so for its leadership. The previous general that they had, Muradov, has been let go. He's been asked to go on vacation, and he has been removed from the SMO. He has been replaced now with Kuzmenko. Um, Kuzmenko is commander of the Vostok Group now. Now he's regarded as a guy that soldiers can relate to, a down to earth kind of character, and we're hoping, that he does a better job than Muradov, because the job that he did is disastrous. Uh, Granted, there were some unforeseen things that did happen. We talked about that on the last two shows. But, I've seen photos that have emerged where there are, seven infantry fighting vehicles slash light tanks. They're not like the full T-72s. They're like, the lighter ones that have a 25 millimeter cannon and a 100 millimeter cannon. And sometimes, like, there's the compartment in the back where people can ride in open air. Anyways, it's a lot of vehicles, and I'm looking at one photo that has like 7 or 8 of them, and like it's abysmal. And another photo has 5, and yeah, I mean, I can see 1 or 2 bodies. that didn't go well. I think soldiers complained about the lack of air support, the lack of planning. If you know, if there's one thing we've learned is that if the Ukrainians have to, if they see somewhere on the front that uh, troops are about to get encircled, they will send troops from other areas as fast as possible in order to stop that from happening. And um, it could be advantageous for the Russians, like it is in Bakhmut, because they have fire control of all the roads. But in Ugledar, it doesn't seem to be the case. And that's mostly because the northern towns north of Ugledar have not been taken. Yes, they're just before the road. There is a way from the north for them to get in. And yes, there is some fire control over that road. But the Ukrainians can ship supplies from the west. Yeah. So it's not as cut off as some other areas like Bakhmut or Avdiivka. Um, Anyhow, let's continue. Of course, more and more shelling of Donetsk and Gorlovka and the other areas in and around Donetsk city. This is a time where the war is a year old. Um, I'm not suggesting that the Ukrainians ever cared about civilian casualties. I'm just suggesting that they care even less because I think there's like a growing hate for them. Like when a war drags on for too long, what will happen is the soldiers will just begin to hate the civilians as much as they hate the the soldiers that they're fighting against because
And
they just
then
consider.
it becomes multi-layered, especially in the case of Ukraine. And I'll reference a story we talked about a couple episodes ago, where the internally displaced people of Ukraine from the east who went westward faced nothing but harassment, is really all I can call it, and that's even a generous term for that,
Yeah,
from Western Ukrainian, both civilian and soldier alike. So not only do you have that disdain for the civilian, you have that disdain for the civilian that you don't even consider a countryman who you think should be left in the meat grinder to fight against the Mongol orcs or whatever the slur of the day is.
right. And that kind of underlines that not just the attitude that Ukrainians have towards East Ukrainians. I mean, yes, they do look at them as a separate people. But I think it also sheds light on the blunders and the Russian planning in the early stages of this war. And that is, as long as this war was happening in the East, generally, people that were sympathetic to the Kiev regime, particularly those in the West, they didn't really care. Um, Most of their boys weren't being drafted. They were in territorial forces that just basically patrolled an area that was at peace. And it would be, left to, um, only the people who most passionately wanted to be part of the Ukrainian armed forces that would go to the front. Now, there were 200,000 of those that were trained by the U.S. over the course of 8 years, but um, the interesting thing is that when Russia decided to go for the big fake to build enough political pressure from surrounding Kiev in order to get a quick capitulation, what that did is it brought the war to the rest of Ukraine, because of course the rest of Ukraine didn't care about the lives of people in eastern and southern Ukraine. And now they cared because now the war finally affected them. And that's just something to think about, right? And in terms of the way this war was planned. Um, Now, that move that Russia did kind of surprised the Ukrainians, and it's what allowed them to shift so many armaments through Crimea into southern Ukraine and created the land bridge. Um, I don't know if that would have been possible if they hadn't done it the way they did. But that is what happened. And like I say, so now I would say most of Ukraine, except for some portions in the east and the south, um, will treat anybody from eastern Ukraine really poorly. Because they will look at them as accomplices. They already hated them anyways, but now they're accomplices as well. Even though they're not going to Russia, even though they might be identifying as Ukrainians and not Russians, that's still never going to be good enough. So to continue the war front news, um, since last week, the Russians have made more gains around Avdiivka. There have been some attempts to take parts of Avdiivka, the town, from the southwest, or yeah, roughly the southwest. Sorry, southeast corner. Avdiivka is like a long um, shaped city, like a kidney bean, and it it goes like a northwest southeast axis. Anyhow, so there's more and more pressure there. The Ukrainians are flooding more reserve troops to keep it from being taken. Of course, if it does, it will be extremely significant. I think for the people of Donetsk, it will be even more significant in some ways than taking Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, since last week, there have been significant gains in the city. Last week, the Russians controlled, let's say, 60% of the city. They easily control now somewhere between 70 to 75% of the city. Um, a pizza parlor named New York was taken 2 days ago. I, I just love that. I remember seeing that headline
I
on
can't believe this
Telegram.
sees the American embassy. That's really harrowing
New
stuff.
York, it's just literally New York pizza exclamation has been taken. But the significance of that is that's the center of Bakhmut right now. They are fighting around the administrative building that 2 weeks ago Prigozhin was pointing at from 800 meters away across the other side of the Bakhmut River. So that gives you an indication of how close they are. They've made significant gains, I mean, for urban warfare, from the north and from the south. Uh, Virtually all of Azom proper. There are industrial sectors south of Azom, but Azom is taken. Um, this was a pretty big deal. The Ukrainians decided not to fight for it, and one of the reasons might have been because Azom was surrounded both on the outside, both on the east and west sides, and that really only gave them the ability to exit out of Azom from the south. Because the north very early on, about a third of it or 25% of it was taken right away um, a few weeks ago. So uh, I would say, I said this last week. If there's going to be a big offensive by the Ukrainians, I think they have to decide whether it's for Bakhmut or whether it's for Zaporozhye. Because now there is video footage confirming that some of the supplies that the Ukrainians have received from NATO members like Turkey, like the Kipri armored vehicle. There's a particular gruesome one with 4 bodies that are just one of the most gruesome things I've ever seen. That was destroyed on trying to get into Bakhmut, and this is the crux of the matter is that the roads to get in are under fire control, so it's very hard not to get hit. Um, Last week I saw more civilian vehicles. This week I'm seeing more military vehicles. Um, and speaking of Bakhmut, I guess we have to speak about Wagner now. Prigozhin made a very interesting statement, and he said that now people have talked about the losses, and what you hear from guys like General Milley is the same script. Oh yes, but the Russians are losing so many men. Now Wagner is a much smaller force than the Ukrainian force. At best, is 6,000 or less, somewhere between 5 to 6,000. the Russians play a supporting role on the flanks. That's what's um, the area outside of Bakhmut, well outside of Bakhmut. That's what's protecting them from incursions by the Ukrainians in force and allowing Wagner to storm more and more buildings. Obviously, it's much harder for the attacker in urban warfare than for the defender. Um, so I don't know what the real losses are, but I know that 2 weeks ago the losses for the Ukrainians, even by Western press, were a lot, and then they flipped the script as soon as it was decided that Zelensky's mind couldn't be changed. Then it's actually Wagner that's losing more forces, and the losses are always greater than the amount of Wagner forces there. But to get back to what Prigozhin said, he said, if Wagner has to die in Bakhmut in order to achieve victory for Russia, for the motherland, and to go on to greater victories afterwards, then that's what has to happen. So in a way, he's hinting that this could be the end of Wagner, and that um, he maybe wants like a glorious end to all of this. It could also be that he's thinking politically down the road. I think Prigozhin has plans for politics. I don't know if that's going to be president, but I'm pretty certain it could be for mayor or some other position, governor. I would not put it past him. I think he's made a name for himself in a very big way. Um, in many ways, it's like the Chechen Akhmat Sila guys in Mariupol being playing such a pivotal role as the guys that stormed the Mariupol. Um, they're going to get the glory because that's a very difficult fight. I think people who commit themselves to that kind of fight, they have committed themselves. They know that they could die. They know that there's a very good chance they will die, and it's a different mindset. Many of them will even say, if I don't commit myself to die, I could die avoiding dying. That is uh, my my own cowardice could lead me to my death quicker than my courage. So that's an interesting thing coming out of Prigozhin. In the northern front, it's the same kind of thing. The Russians are making small incremental gains towards Kupiansk, and they continue to hold the Ukrainians back from Svatovo and from Kremenaya. These are very, very important logistical hubs. And it's another area where the Russians bungled it. Um, they didn't have that many forces. I remember the videos from last late summer, early fall. A lot of the guys that were fighting there, they were not. They would have been the equivalent of territorial forces or SWAT teams, not full-fledged military teams. And a lot of them were old guys that had been in the Lugansk People's Republic for 8 years. No trenches were dug, no bunkers. It's extraordinary, considering also how little manpower they had. Because I think they thought like they could just always retreat to the other side of the Oskal River and that would be enough. And it wasn't, because the Ukrainians met them. They went over, and then Russia had to flood that area with all kinds of forces to rescue them out of places like Liman and Kupiansk. They managed to stop the Ukrainians. You know, not as much as Kherson, but um, it was a victory for the Ukrainians in Kharkov. But it was again a costly victory, and it was for this reason that they couldn't get that objective of getting to Kremenaya and Svatove, because if they did, logistically, that would have been very bad for the Russians, because that's where their supplies go into Donetsk from. So that could have been disastrous. Anyhow, um, so that's it basically for what I have for the war front news. I have other, stories for Russian news and Russian European news, but we can get into that later.
I just want to round out a few stories out of Ukraine. Once again, thank you as always for the Minutiae Minute. It's always very well researched beyond certainly what I can do, as evidenced by some of my solo episodes. But to get into just some peripheral news around Ukraine, we have Kinjal missiles have been reported to hit a joint NATO Ukraine command center. And
Yeah, this is the second one I've heard.
yes, this is.
This is the second report I've seen.
I was actually just about to mention this is about the second or third time I've heard a story like this. Now, this certainly is not the first time NATO personnel have gotten directly caught up in this war, even as battlefield casualties, so to speak. Let's just start with the most prominent example. Poland has an estimated 20,000 troops there in an unofficial capacity. They're volunteers, they're mercenaries, etc., etc., etc. And then the higher estimated reports for casualties among the Poles, among the forces that they had sent in, is about 2,500, which I don't think is unbelievable, maybe a little high, but I think it's generally close to the truth. Then, probably the most prominent example that at least comes to my mind is that one Canadian general that was allegedly nabbed out of Mariupol upon the fall of the city. And there's been a few other instances with this, but this is one of the more significant ones. This is an actual command center, and as we all know, NATO generals, NATO officers, NATO advisors have been taking the role of actually commanding Ukrainian forces. That's the reason they've been able to even perform to the ability that they have right now. I'm not saying the Ukrainian officer class is entirely incompetent, but certainly in order to match Russia the way they have thus far in this war to the point where it has become this bit of a stalemate, sure, you can put it down to poor Russian planning or Russians being over conservative in their approach to this war, which I think both are probably true to an extent. In order to match blow for blow the way the Russians have performed, they've had to had NATO generals from. I use this term very loosely because it's kind of hard to use. Generals from much more serious countries, people with actual experience when it comes to this, rather than just Ukrainian officers. So there was that. None of the NATO countries acknowledged this or even issued any sort of condemnation. So I actually take something like that as a sign that it
Mm,
probably did happen because they and you'll see this with the Israelis in the past, and we'll get into some of the news about Israel in a few minutes here, where whenever something insignificant or minute happens, there's an outrage about it. It's the worst thing ever. Whenever the forces of Hamas or whoever else in the Palestinian territories fire a barrage of very cheaply made rockets, in which most of them are intercepted by the Iron Dome, that's terrible. But when they have an incursion into northern Lebanon that Hezbollah completely routs them, even including as recently as what I think that was 2019 last time they tried to do that, there's no talk of it at all because they know that they got beaten. They know that it is an embarrassment on them, and they do not want to draw attention to it. So I think that this Kinshal
yes.
story is one of those other ones because when something really is egg on your face, when something really is bruising you, you don't want to draw
Mm,
attention to it because that just puts, to mix more metaphors together, that just puts blood in the water. That just makes it more liable to happen. Whereas if it's something less
right.
significant, you can grandstand about it and say, "Look how horrible our enemies are," because ultimately, what they did is of little consequence.
Right, and you could see. I mean, I believe the second time that the Russians had that air base that was attacked by those old '70s Soviet era drones by Ukraine, um, or the A-50 in Belarus, they were very quiet about it. Which, and then there was a video that came out and it showed the drone flying to the plane, landing on it, and then flying away. It didn't bomb it, but it flew away in a way taunting, like, look, I can touch you, right, and you're not doing anything about it, or meaning you're unaware. Now there was also, you mentioned this command post, and probably a less significant command post that was hit this week happened in a town called Drushkovka, Drushkovka is directly west from Bakhmut and Chasov Yar. It's south of Kramatorsk, just south of it, and northwest of Konstantinovka. And I did see video footage um, of a hit, and they were pulling guys out of the rubble. Now, the guy that I saw who got pulled out of the rubble, he was alive. These are this was a Ukrainian concentration of troops. I imagine they have them all over Konstantinovka, Drushkova, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, because the war front, the front line is literally 25 kilometers from there. Um, and then there's also some news. See, Drushkovka is the place that got hit in a retaliatory strike after the New Year's Eve hit on the Russian installation in Donetsk. That and the fatality figure has risen from 89 to 109 now. I meant to mention that last week, but yeah, I'm with you. They're very quiet about this. Now you're seeing other newspapers pick up on it. The Western press is not going to pick up on this, but
No, they're not going to pick up
we've
on anything that isn't Snake Island or Ghost of Kiev. I know that was very, very
yeah,
true, very early on in the war, but even still, while the coverage is not as absurd as it was, say, in March 2022, they still keep it to about similar levels. They have to keep it a bit more grounded and believable now. They have to cast a bit of doubt because the Ukrainian forces are not performing as well as they either expected or propagandized people to believe, to the point where the war looks like it does now. But beyond, especially when you're trying to speak to an Anglophone audience, now I think this applies to other places in the world, other places in the West especially, but particularly an Anglophone audience, it needs to be a very sensationalized story. The kind of stuff we do, of course, we have our biases, as I'm sure you all know, but the kind of stuff we do does not typically appeal to an Anglophone audience, which is kind of interesting that this show has the audience that does, all things considered.
mm, yeah, yeah. So I tend to believe that this was a successful hit. Do you remember there were a few hits in last year in Nikolaev, and then south of Nikolaev on the west side of the Dnieper, there's a town. I'm gonna get it wrong. I think it's called Ochkovka. The Russians always claim that there's British intelligence there. They hit some kind of a compound as well where there was a concentration of troops. I mean, if you look at the way the British behave, this war is as important to the British as it is to the Americans. And the Brits have a history of being provocative in order to draw the Americans in. Not not very different than the Israelis. And
Especially post World War One, I would say, no matter what intervention the British have, they are always eager to get the Americans in. I think the Falkland Wars is a much overlooked but a very good example of this, where you have America at
yes,
the time, which has a very good relationship with Argentina, which you would
yep,
think is important. Same hemisphere, everything, other major country in the hemisphere. I mean, you look at it objectively, the most important partners America probably have outside of Canada and Mexico is Argentina and Brazil, just because of the sheer size and the weight that they pull on the South American continent. But through British pressures, the Americans began sanctioning and cutting off arms supplies to the Argentinians because of a dispute over an island. Now, the Americans had no vested interest beyond maybe an honor system in the British holding the Falklands at this point. But they still did, and it, I mean, you compared it to the Israelis, which I think is a very good comparison, because I think the British also have that kind of weight that the Israelis do throw around when it comes to influence within the American political establishment. For example, remember who spied on Trump? The British did. They
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
they
mm-hmm,
know
mm-hmm.
they know where their paychecks come from, so to speak. They know who they rely on. So, especially upon the decline of the empire, being on very good terms with America in that regard is exactly what they need, and they need America throw the punches that they just aren't capable of throwing anymore. Because another example of this is the Crimean War. The British had the military force, along with a joint effort with the French, to deal a somewhat of a defeat to the Russians. Now, although it wasn't a crippling defeat, it did call it a lot of questions in Russia, both militarily, civilizationally, politically. But at the end of the day, they were able to do that through a joint effort. Now they can't do that, so they have to get the Americans to do it in their place.
Yes. Right, and it's another tell was just how violently the House of Commons in Britain reacted when America decided to pull out. It was crazy. I don't know if you saw any of that footage, but they were uh, incredibly vocal about this, and we're staying behind even if the Americans leave, uh, because they know, they don't want to be this periphery island um, that will become more irrelevant in the coming years. But there is just a little bit of sort of not war front news per se, but war related news. I just wanted to say that the Americans rather, they're introducing a new deployable switchblade called the Switchblade 300. Now, this will operate in colder temperatures and fly for a longer period of time, but it has a munition that's more powerful. I've already seen them take out a Russian S-300. So now the Russians have been very good about knocking these things out. It's why you hardly ever see any of these UAVs taking out Russian equipment. Because the air defense for the Russians is very good, but of course, no air defense system is perfect. So they're supposed to get a ton of these, even though the I saw an article in the what is it, Defense One um, publication saying it's very hard to double the GMLRS production. This is for the HIMARS systems and the M270. Um, that's one of the growing problems is shell production that's been in the news, and the Russians are clearly able to produce far more shells than the Americans and the Europeans, even the South Koreans, because they're of course contributing this about 50 countries altogether. Um, Shoigu visited the Ural area where production for shells has increased. Because Russia's, they're going with this war of attrition. Uh, and for that, they know that if you believe guys like Reznikov, for every 20 Russian volleys, Ukraine is able to return somewhere between 5 to 7. So it's considerably less. Um, Anyhow, so I wanted to mention that just as some war front news, but
Certainly.
not necessarily related directly to the fighting and the casualties and taking land and all of that.
And I'm glad you had brought that up because that does lead me into another story here about air defense systems, where Zelensky has actually accused the U.S. of sending faulty anti air systems to the Ukrainian forces. And let me just read exactly his statement right here in the summary of that. And this comes from, once again, one of the best channels on Telegram when it comes to following any of this. The Slavyangrad channel on Telegram reports that, according to Zelensky, one of the countries sent him a non-working air defense system, so the Ukrainians, quote, had to change again and again. He did not specify the country, even though he implied it was U.S. forces, if you actually read through the full statement. Zelensky added that several of the weapons that Western countries have promised to send, including Patriot air defense batteries, have never arrived. Now, I completely believe everything said in that story. because the West is it's a combination of things. The West is scraping the bottom of the barrel at a certain point, and they're also trying to offload their older, less efficient equipment when it comes to this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're an Eastern European country, say if you're, let's just pick a random to once again borrow the term Weasel Country. If you're, let's just say, Slovakia. Now, I know Slovakia has a little bit of a interesting position in this war that they're not entirely on board with it. But when you're Slovakia sending MiG jets like they have, you're probably going to be stripped out of your military arsenal. That's just the way it is. That's why these countries are in NATO, because they knew this day would come eventually. When you're Western Europe, you get a bit more of a pass. Germany can send in their military equipment, still have some left over. Now, they'll talk about being undersupplied militarily, which they are, but they're not going to get their arsenal stripped until all the Eastern European countries in front of them get their arsenal stripped. And then you move to the US. While military production certainly is not what it once was, it is still a formidable power. They can still crank out enough. Now, will it be enough in time? That's the big question. I don't think it will be personally. But
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, what we have here is very large, grandiose promises to Ukrainian forces to encourage them to stick it out, stay in this fight, so they don't go to the negotiating table like they did back in March 2022 before that was shut down by Boris Johnson arriving in Kiev to completely scuttle the negotiations. And I know Zelensky is pretty much beyond negotiation at this point, so let's just say any potential successor, as it were. So
Mm-hmm.
they need to make these large promises, but then they eventually have to deliver something. And what you end up getting is less advanced, less modern systems at your doorstep, and systems that are less adept to be able to really take out or defend against what the Russians are throwing at them. So that is worth noting that although you get a lot of talk about the Patriot systems, the HIMARS systems, the Leopard tanks being sent to Ukraine, the amount of numbers and the rate at which these things are arriving aren't necessarily matching what has been promised to Ukraine. And you could probably imagine a lot of the design around Ukrainian strategy, even by the NATO commanders that are in Ukraine, is probably designed around these projections. Maybe not exactly, but they probably designed around a rough estimation of these projections. So they are putting themselves in a very strange position. Now, once again, I don't think these people are stupid by any means. Now, I'm not saying they're necessarily the brightest in the world either, but they probably know what's at stake. They probably know what they have to do with the equipment that they have, and it really comes down to will it be enough? Can they be resourceful enough to make it enough? And sometimes, no matter how resourceful you are, you're simply just outgunned, outmanned, etc., etc. Speaking of outmanned, Russia is pushing for another conscription wave of 147,000 to come out in, I believe, late spring. I think they're aiming for May for another partial mobilization. So we'll see the ultimate result of that and how that will change the outcomes. But that does seem to be a trend with smaller Russian mobilizations, while the Ukrainians, meanwhile, on their 10th round of mobilization, in which case, with the way they're doing their mobilization, clearly the quality of the soldiers is getting poorer and poorer every time. But it does call into question, without a direct NATO involvement, and even with direct NATO involvement, how long would it take to get assets on the ground in Ukraine? And it's really Ukraine has to buy time that it does not have with improper equipment, I would say, is the current
Mm-hmm.
impasse that we have in the war right now. Because they're not complete collapse, they haven't been completely rooted. They're still able to hold the line with what they have, but they won't be able to make any effect on this war until they get more. And by the time they get more, it may just be too late for them in general.
Right. And all along this time, I should mention that, you know, Russia's planning for this war in some ways was flawed, although I think sometimes people um, tend to fall prey to narratives of like, complete incompetence on the Russians' part. They'll even say things they should have attacked with everything they had in 2014. I think the Russians didn't because I don't think they were prepared to fight a war like that if they were going to be taken off the SWIFT system. Uh, I don't think 8 years ago. I think 8 years ago, even though it doesn't sound like a lot, is a lot of years. That's how much planning it took. I think even the production of shells is something that Russia has steadily increased since 2005. You see these articles in Western press saying that, it's going to be too expensive. But the thing is, the Russians have already created or expanded facilities for making munitions, and they invested in a lot for a much larger war. So in many ways, they have been preparing for this war in the same way that Ukraine has been preparing for this war, which is why there are so many extensive underground and bunker sites and trench work. The other thing too is the Russians have adapted and not just to UAVs, but they're able to shoot down much of the HIMARS. Again, they can't get through all of them. Often the HIMARS are successful. We already mentioned that on this show, but for the first time, they knocked down a Grom 2, which is a special kind of uh, Ukrainian missile. I don't know if it's like the Tochka or if it's a different kind of missile, but it's one that has evaded the Russians, and this week they were able to shoot that down. So, the Russians too have adapted and are learning how to overcome some of the strengths that the Ukrainians have in their court. Um, and so, yes, how long is this? How long can this go on? Um, I do think again, like going for Kiev, maybe it was necessary, but what that did is it did actually, like I think the West was right that it did galvanize support amongst Ukrainians who might have been indifferent to the war in eastern Ukraine, and they weren't. And after the fall of Mariupol, shelling of Ukraine in order to stop war planning and all kinds of other things that frankly happens in war. That still went on well throughout late March and April, even though the Russians did their goodwill retreat because they thought they were going to get the peace deal in Ankara. Um, I would say that even after the fall of Lysychansk, which you saw low morale in some of the prisoners the Russians caught, there were a lot of people. I remember Dima from Military Analysis or Military Summary Channel saying, he personally knows guys that are waiting for months to join, some of these units. Now, it's safe to say that maybe half those guys are all dead now. Um, Even the Western press admits close to 200,000 killed in action. Definitely the forces that were trained by the U.S. in since 2014, they're mostly gone, either dead or just not capable of fighting anymore.
Now, with that being said, that is very interesting, just microcosm in terms of the scale of the war in Ukraine. I just do have a couple more stories coming out of Ukraine, so I'll start with the less significant one here first. And that is Orban's statements about what he expects to happen in Ukraine. So there is talks where there may be an EU peacekeeper force sent in. Orban has said that he believes that will be sent in, and he had also said that he believes that we're at risk of seeing another world war. And he's, to quote him directly, I'm sure that the threat of world war is not an exaggeration. Now, that doesn't surprise me coming out of somebody who has had his people and his diaspora, for that matter. Hungary has a very large diaspora, as we've covered in the past, feels this way about this war, that out of any country in Europe, it seems that Hungary's one of the top ones that has a vested interest in not seeing this war boil over. For the fact that, number one, it borders Ukraine, it's a NATO country, it has a large diaspora that's being affected by this war, and it also has a very strong economic partnership with Russia. So they're one of the last countries in Europe that would want to see a major escalation of this sort. And I wouldn't be shocked if there's some sort of EU peacekeepers in the works. And as we were discussing a few episodes ago, with the story around Polish deployments and putting Lvov temporarily under the jurisdiction of the Polish consulate or whatever nonsense they wanted to go on with that. But that is a potential scenario where perhaps as the conflict does grow colder, perhaps the Pentagon was right and peace negotiations are allowed to proceed into September, October this year, and there is some sort of, let's just say, marginal Russian victory, to say the least. And given the state of the Russian government, now I know statements have come out from Putin, from other figures within the Kremlin, that have changed tone on this, but we have to remember that traditionally, and even during this war, Putin has shown that he does seem to far more prefer negotiation to conflict. And in fact, he thought he was going to get the peace deal in Ankara. He thought he was going to be able to trigger negotiations if he withdrew out of areas of the Kherson Oblast. We've seen this pattern time and time again. So there is a potential scenario where there is some sort of at least temporary negotiated peace. EU quote unquote peacekeepers go in and restabilize the regions of Ukraine that weren't lost in the peace agreement, and really, as we've discussed on previous episodes, prepare Ukraine for yet another go at this conflict. Deliver the promised arms shipments, or at least some degree of the promised arms shipments, rearm them, so even though Russia has taken this territory, they still have this perpetual thorn in their side, because they can't force a Ukrainian victory if they can't force the Ukrainians, at least back to the pre-February 2022 state of things, even if it is just pushing the Russians back to the part of the Donbass that the separatists controlled and still have Crimea, whatever. They're going to go with the next best thing, which is to keep this perpetual low-level military conflict right on their border. This is not unheard of. We've done it before in several places. Look at our policy in the Middle East for the past 30 years. These are the kind of things that we do. This is what we're doing in Syria right now. So you can't put it past the American foreign policy planners and their proxies in Europe to take this approach. And I would say, at least so far, unless there are major Russian breakthroughs, if the war does continue at this current rate, I think there's a very real possibility it ends in a temporary negotiated peace, but ultimately has a low level conflict. And I think at this point, the Russian strategists, even maybe going up to Putin himself, probably do understand this problem to some degree, that there has to be a definitive conclusion on Ukraine, because if they accept a half-hearted peace, even if it gave them most of what they want, even if it gave them full control of the four annexed oblasts and a land bridge to Crimea, ultimately it would not be the end of the Ukrainian question for the interests of Russia.
Hmm. Yeah, and this is, I think, where the question of China comes in, and it's not so much China. I know, the agreements that were signed last week do include supporting each other's territorial integrity, which, quite honestly, that's military support. Now, both countries have, for arms, massive production capabilities. China's are even greater. But the one thing that could change things, because the longer that America occupies itself with Ukraine, the sooner that China will overtake uh, America's influence in Southeast Asia. Uh, America has to make a decision. At the moment, it thinks it can fund Ukraine indefinitely, remain in whatever small amounts in the Middle East, and at the same time, eventually go to war with China or contain China sometime between 2025 and 2027. Now, the reason I bring this up is, you know, China had two ways to manage, the selling of USDs. Uh, and that was, one of them was to slash growth. Okay. Um, or sell the USDs, right? But now what been seeing this week, we saw a deal being made with Brazil and China to exclusively use the yuan, maybe even the Brazilian dollar, I forget its name. India has stated that it will now only trade in the rupee. We know Saudi Arabia is um, going to be like, I guess, a junior member, forget the exact term, for the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. So,
And that's on top of
um,
their cooperation with BRICS at this point, and
yes,
that BRICS is also considering developing its own currency for trade outside of the US dollar.
right. So now they have the third option, which is to just stop using the US dollar. They're already selling it and getting rid of it, but now there just won't be use for it, right? And we're seeing India make this move. These are huge economies, right? Um, this is no small thing,
Well, I
and
don't I
I
don't want to
think.
get too sidetracked on this point for now, but I will
Mhm,
mention that back when, say, an organization like BRICS or the SCO was first formed, say in the early 2000s, it was a very quaint idea that you had these alternative blocks cropping up in an American
yeah,
controlled world. And to a degree, they were American approved, that you could have your club so long as you fall within the broader American led order. And I could see in 2009 somebody scoffing at BRICS and saying that's just a little club, it's whatever. But taking that attitude now shows a bit of ignorance on the part of whoever makes that argument, because while these countries are certainly not on top of the world yet, these are economies that are strong. These are countries with vast natural resources. These are countries that have shown immense growth within the past decade at least. Whether we're talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, maybe not so much South Africa. That's really a different question. But I mean, under the guidelines of say foreign investment and development, I could see the Chinese getting the South American economy at least back online, serviceable to the position that they needed to be. But right now, what you have, and that's not to mention all the other countries that have tried to join and applied for partnerships: Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc., etc., etc. And this applies to both BRICS and the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That you have these countries that are all burgeoning, I guess you could say, and even the ones that aren't have strategic location, have strategic resources under the leadership of two countries that are, one is an economic powerhouse, the other one is currently one of the few countries in the world that is actually taking up an armed struggle against the American-led world order, even if it's just battling its proxies, on top of a major energy producer, one of the largest energy producers in the world, and also largest country in the world, geographically spans two continents, the connecting
yeah.
bridge between two continents. So these are not insignificant nations we're talking about here. These are nations that, especially as the American empire does decline, they have the ability to carve out chunks of the world for themselves and shape the direction of the future of the world for decades to come.
Hmm. Right. I mean, China right now is catching up to the IMF as a kind of last resort loan option and bailout option. Um, 240 billion for nations on the Belt and Road loans, right? It's still behind the IMF and the US, but it is catching up very quickly. I mean, we're seeing major changes happening in 2023, and a lot of this is really based on the exportation of America's culture war upon these countries who want nothing of it. And and even if that weren't happening, right? Just America's foreign policy in the Middle East and the sanctions on Russia, ignoring everything else, is enough to sway these countries over.
And once
There
again,
is,
I'm not going to make the argument that, say, Russia and China are quote unquote benevolent, whatever that's supposed to mean. But
yeah, yeah.
on top
It's
of,
just options.
yes, it's just options. But I just did want to expand a little on what you're saying. On top of American foreign policy, at least nowadays, being a very culturally corrosive force, whether that be the LGBTQ, CIA stuff, whatever else that might be. Just traditionally, as you're referencing the Middle East, it's both belligerent and schizophrenic as well. There is no
Hmm.
consistency. There is no trust to be had. You have Gaddafi, who agrees to nuclear disarmament. 8 years later, is thrown out. You have Saddam, who agrees to Western peace terms after the first Gulf War. Somewhere 8 to 10 years later, he's also thrown out of power. You have Assad, who made all these appeals to the West early on, early 2000s, is still one of the targets of color revolution in 2010, 2011. And again, that's just to name a few. So this pattern keeps on continuing. So not only do you have this extremely aggressive power, you have this power that simply cannot stick to its word, that cannot be trusted. And really, I would say what's happening right now is the Europeans learning the lesson of what the rest of the world has had to put up with. Now, I'm not saying American European relations were great before now, but it is much more blatant. It is a much more heavy-handed approach than what we have seen in the past. So it's the entire world learning that. Whereas, while Russia and China one day may do that, currently they're not doing that. So you can either look at the guys who are doing that to you now, or the guys who might do that to you in the future, and it becomes a very easy choice to make.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Yeah, the incentives are not there. In a way, what China represents is, for many other countries, the old and the comfortable. That is, while you may have all kinds of fiscal responsibilities and there might be financial ownership to China, you won't have to jettison your entire history and identity as a people.
In
Right?
many
They're
ways,
not they're not asking you to do that.
and in fact, I would say the Chinese are actually very protective of their culture, where they view it as something that should be exclusively theirs, and they're not necessarily keen
Yes.
on the outsiders speaking Chinese or participating in Chinese culture. That they're very insular people in that regard. But
Hmm.
I would say in many ways, Europe notwithstanding, because of the major American military and economic presence there, that this really is what we're seeing right now, a revolt of the old world against the new world.
Right. And I mean, Saudi Arabia is now going to develop a 12 billion oil refinery in China. Saudi Arabia trades more with China than it does to America. So it doesn't make sense to continue to trade with China using the American dollar. I mean, really, it's the only way to add pressure in America. Now, I think if you made America collapse, not that I'm in any way some kind of expert in economics, but from what I've read and from what I've will listen to throughout the week from various experts, um, is that it would hurt the entire global economy if that happened. And for this reason, I don't think China wants to become like this world hegemon where the yuan is the only real currency you can trade with. I don't think they want that.
I would
I don't
agree.
think they want the burden of that because, as you just pointed out, like they don't have an identity that says behind scratch anybody and inside them is a little Chinese guy, right? With the Americans, anybody's an American. Scratch hard enough and there's an American underneath there, right?
Yeah, there's that
um very
one.
different philosophies.
Yeah, there's that one Stanley Kubrick quote I cannot repeat on the show because we are on YouTube, but I'm sure you all know the one I'm talking about. But with that aside, what I will add with that is China's goals, love them or hate them, are much more pragmatic than what the American empire has in mind, to the point where
Yeah.
although they do want growth in economic power, although they do want a more outsized influence in the world, they do not see the benefit in having to manage the entire world from Beijing the same way that America manages the entire world from Washington, D.C. While that has had certainly many benefits, you could argue that the drawbacks have been just as many, if not more. And of course,
Hmm.
the people in Washington, D.C., they have no problem exploiting I'll just put it this way, what's left of the American nation in order to achieve that goal. But China is a country much more conscious of its identity, with a much more long-standing identity, to the point where even the same Communist Party that 60, 70 years ago was trying to completely overturn Chinese culture has now made efforts to try to bring somewhat of a restoration to traditional Chinese culture. They're not going to sacrifice on that on the altar of GDP, say as the modern American state would, or just the American state in general, or the American Empire, whatever terminology is your preferred.
Yeah.
But with that, I suppose we can round out the news in Ukraine with probably one of the stories I'm less eager to talk about, one of the more important ones to talk about, which is the situation with the Kiev Lavra and
Mm.
the State Department backed church. So, getting into that, it was this week where the evictions were supposed to happen. Now, I believe it was March 29th that was the deadline for the real canonical church to give way to the State Department backed cult, and that has not happened yet. The monks and the clergy there have stood strong. So far, as of today, you've had the arrest of two Ukrainian metropolitans, which, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the church hierarchy, is a very high ranking bishop, just to put it in very
Yeah.
simple terms.
Like an archbishop.
Yes, exactly. And that has occurred today. Now, they have not arrested the metropolitan of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. As far as I know, I believe there were two other ones. Somebody can correct me on the details of that.
I think Father Poffil, Metropolitan Poffil, he is under house arrest. It did now he administers the lavras, and he does have like one of these ankle beacons. He's under some kind of house arrest. There's video footage of that.
Oh, so something you put on a common criminal, I see. I mean, that should just
Yeah,
tell you
yeah,
everything you need to know
yeah.
about this entire situation. But there has been standoffs outside of it with the people who are aligned with the State Department backed cult, just to average everyday people, to the clergy, to the monks, just having a complete standoff. Now, as far as it has seemed, nobody has really thrown the first punch, so to speak, in either a metaphorical. I mean, I suppose they have in a metaphorical sense, but in a more literal sense that no, it hasn't broken out into absolute clashes between the people yet. You haven't had the Ukrainian state authorities really push in and try to just force the eviction. And
Hmm.
I think that what we're seeing here is actually a surprising moment of pragmatism from the Ukrainian authorities because they could sell most people in Ukraine and in the world that, of course, we need our own church. Of course, we need our own State Department backed cult. We're entitled to that because we're a sovereign nation, independent culture, blah, 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 all the reasons they'll go down. And there were a lot of people who were genuinely sympathetic to that, saying, oh, perhaps it is time for them to have their own church, whatever. But as they became more heavy handed, as you had the Ukrainian state crack down on the canonical church, support, at least outside of Ukraine, has soured on that. Even people who are ostensibly pro Ukraine have soured on that. Even bishops and clergy from other countries that, and we're talking like NATO countries too, that have been very much in line with the Ukrainians who you thought maybe at some points were going to go along with Constantinople in terms of just breaking from the Russian Orthodox Church if you listen to at least some of the
Hmm.
rhetoric coming out of these parts of the world. Even they have drawn the line at this. This is them completely overplaying their hand. And look, I have said it before. I think everyone who watches shows knows where we stand. We are both practicing Orthodox Christians, and I'm not. There's certainly better people you could go to for convincing arguments about the faith, and I'm not here to try to convince you of that, at least for the time being. But I will say, if you have any sort of belief in just anything, let's put it this way, you, to a certain degree, have to believe that the Ukrainians are bringing punishment upon themselves by doing this. In fact, there was actually an interesting exchange. I've lost the clip. I can't find because I would love to share it of one of these confrontations outside of this, and it's just it's not a monk, not a priest, not a bishop, just a normal person saying that well, because of this. Ukraine is destined to lose the war now. We've lost this. Our country will be partitioned. The Russians will take the east. The Polish will take the west. It like that they seriously brought up the partition map, saying that because the Ukrainian state has done this, that they have brought upon themselves a divinely inspired defeat. Which I'm not going to definitively say that because I certainly don't feel it's my place to say that. But I think there is a real rationale behind that. That if the Ukrainian state does this, that they are, I can think of no better word, cursing themselves when it comes to something like this. And to the point where you even had some of these UN religious freedom organizations. That was a very passing statement, but even they had some degree of
Mhm.
condemnation for this. Nobody is behind this except the most hardliners. Even
Yeah.
and it's actually interesting because this came out of the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was the one who really kicked off this entire controversy in the first place, this entire crisis in the first place, I should say more appropriately. But you even have bishops under Constantinople, and even in the Church of Greece, which also went along with the Ukrainian Church, who are critical of this. It's, I mean, you can't determine the truth on popularity. I understand that, but it is such an unconscionable thought, especially now that they've taken it to its logical conclusion, that they're completely undoing their own project. Now, will the Ukrainian state force be enough to force, let's just put it in very simple terms, a quote unquote temporary victory for them? I genuinely do not know. But point being is, I mean, they've certainly lost where it matters, and I think even in a much more temporal sense that they have brought defeat upon themselves when it comes to this issue. Perhaps I'm being far too optimistic about something like this, but really, in terms of and it, once again, also could just be my own biases. In terms of the backlash I've seen from this, coming from across the spectrum in opinions on the ecclesiastical situation, on opinions on the war, I don't see how this is going to stand in any long-term meaningful sense.
Yeah. I mean, the West won't care because the West is irreligious, and the part that is religious, doesn't. I mean, really, it doesn't respect the Orthodox Church, let alone know very much about it. Um, Now, Nina Byzantina on her blog has written an article with an amazing quotation uh, from the Greek Catholic priest Nikolai Medinsky. So, go check it out. Nina does have a Telegram channel, and you can find her on Twitter as well. But here's the quote: "We will not cast pearls before you, Muscovite swine. You are a powerless biomass. We will not only take this church from you, but we will also take everything. We will kick you out of our land and from the Kiev Larva," written October 27th, 2017.
I
So,
wonder how these hardline Ukrainian nationalist uniots feel about the Pope's rather measured statements on this war so far. Like, are they going to end up joining with the State Department cult? That brings in a lot of interesting questions. At least I think so.
well, I know when Reagan visited Russia, he met with the Uniats, but he would not meet with like the Orthodox. So,
I mean,
it's always been the
that's
case.
yeah,
It's always been the
that's not
case.
shocking in any degree, but yeah, like I don't know, I I just find it, and perhaps humorous isn't the right word, but there is just something about it, the fact that you have these hardline uniots that are, I guess, you could say more Catholic than the Pope in this case, even though nowadays who isn't? But it does make you wonder that their entire identity is the fact that they're in union with Rome, but then Rome takes a very measured stance, all things considered, on this entire conflict as just as a whole. And yeah, I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric I've come to expect out of Ukraine and let's just say Ukrainian ethno religions, because I mean that's what these two are. And I know a lot of naysayers say, oh, the Orthodox are an ethnic religion. Look, I could dispute that. I'm not going to waste time disputing that right now. But like definitively, the State Department backed cult and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, those are fine through and through ethnic religions. But I'm getting off topic here. That's all I had about it. So we will see the ultimate outcome of that because so far nothing has budged. And really the only thing I can say is pray to God for these people who are holding the line.
being persecuted.
Absolutely. These Ukraine, I will say this once again. I've said it before. I will say this once again. Ukraine is the closest living successor to the early Bolsheviks when it comes to church persecution. Not the Russians, not anyone else. It's the Ukrainians right now, and we're seeing it play
Yeah.
out in real time.
I mean, I saw one of the faithful from the Lavra on her knees with the cross praying, and there's all these local Kievites dancing around her with music mocking her. Like imagine that brings you joy. Like these people have already broken off with Moscow, right? They've already condemned Russia's attack, right? What more do you want? I mean, this is kind of part of the Ukrainian narrative, their narrative for their identity, and that is it's always somebody else's fault. Someone is always responsible for their lack of achievement or um, for their destitute state. It's always someone else, and they're very careful not to blame certain groups, but will always blame Russia, right?
There's the
It's like
thing.
that old joke, and
Yeah, go
every
ahead.
time there's three Ukrainians, there are two bosses and one traitor. I know it's crude, but
I
but
mean,
like
it's accurate, but I did want to touch on what you had said because, as we know, Ukraine is a very divided country in terms of identity, where you have a lot of the Westerners who are the bulk of support for both the Greek Catholic and the State Department backed cult. And then in the East, you get more of the people who are pro Russia, if not outright identifying as Russians. But then you have that more central one that are not like the West, but not entirely Russians themselves, which I would say is probably the bulk of the people who make up the canonical church that is just that is still, I would say, pro-Ukraine, even though the entire entire rank and file of the church at that point, from the clergy on down, is they've been in support of Ukraine during the war because most of them do see themselves as Ukrainians. But I'm getting too much into minute detail here. But the fact that you have them right there, who are the people in Ukraine who say we're distinct people, but we do have some sort of kinship, some sort of commonality with the Russian people. And honestly, the people who have probably been most affected by this war, who would, under any other circumstances, like to see themselves as maybe not necessarily one people, but a brother people with the Russians, where feelings may not be that they're completely Russian, but they aren't like the West, where they're just completely anti-Russian, that they're Turkic Mongol orcs who are coming to destroy us all and implement blah 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 blah. But point being is, it goes back to the point where de-Russification of Ukraine has to go so far that you have to undermine Ukrainian identity itself, and that any connection to Russia has to be completely erased to the point where in
yeah.
2014 it was claiming Russian historical figures as Ukrainian. In 2022, 2023, it's erasing these historical figures that 8 years ago you were claiming were Ukrainian themselves.
Right, right. And I should mention, because I do think it complements what you're saying, and that is Father Medinsky's line about, we're not going to cast pearls before you Muscovites fine. Again, they're just incapable. They secretly believe they're the real Russians, right? That's why they will always call them Muscovites because it just irks them that they have the name. It's one of the most pathetic traits I've ever seen. But the thing is he said this when they attempted to burn down and take the Church of the Annunciation. This is like central Western Ukraine. This was an Orthodox church, and the church was like literally built 100 years before there was even the Greek Catholic Church, right? Which I'm sorry, but it's a Roman psyop. Okay, it just is.
Oh no,
And
you read the foundational documents; they admit to it.
yeah, it literally is like it was literally created for the same reasons that America, you know, funded neo-Nazis. It's just to subvert Russia. That's all it is.
Yeah,
But I
it's
I I find that hilarious that he's saying this, and the church is like 100 years older than his church, the physical church there.
yeah, and I mean that's the case for a lot of these where founded in the tail end of the 16th, 17th century, and then they claim this long-standing history, and it's I mean, I'll put it this way. The reason why there's no such thing as a Byzantine Catholic outside of areas that are majority Catholic is because it's fundamentally incoherent. I mean, you look at the Carpathian populations that migrated to the United States to just get on a little ethnic and religious demographic tangent. The reason why so many of them ended up becoming Orthodox again is because outside of the influence of Catholic state and ecclesiastical authorities, their entire worldview just falls apart. It's something that has to be fundamentally imposed. And
Hmm.
it, again, especially back then, now I know with literacy and information being much more available, that there is a ways to access information and learn more about it. But especially if you're somebody who can barely read, if read at all, living in a village in Eastern Europe at the time, you probably aren't going to know the difference of whether you're under Rome, Moscow, or whoever else in your village parish. That's just the way it is.
Hmm.
So you had the loyalty split back and forth. It was mainly a fight among the ecclesiastical structures of the Roman and the Orthodox Church at the time. So at the end of the day, it's a very, I would say, strange anachronistic organization, the Byzantine Catholic churches, and the question of them still existing today. I like I said, especially now that the Roman Catholic Church does not have any civil or ecclesiastical authority that it can enforce on populations in a civil sense in Europe. You figured it's just going on inertia at this point. There's really nothing backing it up. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church proper, I will admit, there are plenty of faithful. Even though I disagree with a lot of what they say, you could argue that they have a coherent theology. The Orthodox certainly do. But then you have this weird group stuck in the middle that just simply exists on inertia. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised barring some effort by Rome in order to try to revitalize this for some geopolitical reasons, if this organization just fizzles out.
Yeah, in many ways, this is sort of the foundation of the Galicians' long-held claim that they're Europeans and that the Russians are not. This message has always been reinforced. Speaking of Brzezinski, in '99 said that the primary enemy of NATO is orthodoxy. Those are his words.
That's a very
Okay.
Polish statement.
Yeah, no kidding.
I mean, that's really
If we have time, I would like, I don't know if we do, but if we have time, I know this is impromptu, but would like just a short focus on my weasel country of origin, Macedonia.
well. Of course we do, and
Emil's not the only guy who comes from a weasel country.
yeah, I mean, I'm from once again Zimbabwe across the Atlantic, so I can't say that much. But do go on.
So this a bit of news. Some good and some bad news. Well, we all know that the Macedonians donated to Ukraine, besides shells, which are not that many, roughly 31 T-72s. I think some armored personnel carriers, but how many? The number evades me. There might have been jets, but the news this week is they have transferred 12 Mi-24 helicopters to Kiev. It's not insignificant, right? And of course, it was Ukraine, not the nationalists run Ukraine, but the Ukraine from 23 years ago that lent us those to fight back against the Albanians, which of course the Americans were supporting
Yeah,
after
I
we
mean
brought
you
them,
can
after we took care of them as refugees. It's
yeah.
hilarious.
And you can
Uh,
ultimately say that the Ukrainian aid to you guys at the time was laundered through Russia, that Russia didn't want to directly provide it, so they had the Ukrainians provide it, so on and so forth. But, I mean, and if you want to look at it that way, it's a real stab in the back that we helped you fight off these foreign
yeah.
populations that were trying to supplant you, that were trying to make the next Kosovo, and you send them to us to fight us when we want to prevent just this complete ethnic cleansing of our people in this
Yeah.
region. So, yeah, that I think that was worth mentioning. And while we're on the topic of weasel
Yeah.
countries, I suppose we can get into
I
just
just I
your.
let,
Yeah,
let me
go ahead.
just sorry, let me just follow up. So our defense minister for Macedonia is a woman by the name of Slavyanka Petrovska. So she was responsible for this. Apparently, she's fallen into some kind of a depression. This is all over. This is in several Macedonian newspapers. I'm guessing it could be her conscience. I'm guessing there's people criticizing her because Global Homo, of course, has already started to entrench itself within Macedonia. The clergy in Macedonia, the Macedonian Orthodox Church of Ohrid, has already condemned schools for introducing a new gender studies program. It's going to be the trans stuff. That's what it is. Make no mistake. And on top of that, but the little bit of good news is the Macedonian Orthodox Church has refused communion with the heretical, thank you, Bartholomew Orthodox Church from Constantinople or Istanbul or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and they
Um,
recently amended that schism ended up back under Serbia, who then gave them their own autocephaly, which was it was a very flowing movement, and it also I would say does show that these kind of wounds ultimately can be healed, and that they have been in the past, and even like what you
mm,
mentioned, the very recent past. So I would say I would leave just the final point on the entire Ukrainian State Department backed cult with that. That of course there's always a way something like this can be. It might not. I mean, what when how long did the Macedonian schism go on? What was that, like 60 years at that point?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so look, there's ways for these to be resolved, and I mean there were far older, far more contentious ones that have also been resolved. So I think a lot of people do look at this just in the here and now and think that, well, this clearly is a very foreboding sign, and which I agree it is, but they get too caught up in that and realize that when you zoom out, that we've dealt with this before, we'll deal with it again, and that there are ultimately solutions to these sort of things.
Right, and even a country like Romania is able to withstand some of the global homo, despite the fact that it's well entrenched in NATO and in the EU. You see that as well, of course, with Hungary. So there is the possibility of some pushback. I'm just saying, for a country like Macedonia, quite honestly, it does not have the leadership or the strength to do that. Now, maybe its only saving grace is the extreme skepticism of Macedonian leadership in Macedonia, political leadership, that is, and the kind of extreme skepticism they have of media, including Western media. They will hate this. I know that, and I hope that goes a certain distance. But I pray for them as well, because it's disgusting what the disease that has taken over America is spreading.
And I believe it was actually a conversation with you and your blood kin I was having, because believe it or not, we have met in person. That did happen a few months ago. That when it comes to that, Macedonia, officially known as North Macedonia, just to dispel any confusion or hostility. Of course, I'm a very welcoming person. I like to soothe over all the ethnic conflicts in the audience and certainly not inflame them the slightest. But they're one of the more, I guess you could say, for lack of a better word, traditional countries in Europe where people do get married young. There is high church attendance, and there is low divorce rate, low abortion rate, etc., etc. And even they are not immune to something like this.
Right, because they're just going to wear you down. They're just going to wear you down. Right? I mean, America, when we came to Canada, okay, so it was less true for Canada than it was for America. But like when we, you know, this is a very different place in the 70s. Let me just say that for those who weren't born in the 20th century, or weren't born, let's say, before the 90s. I promise you, it was a very, very different place. Um, but they persisted. They're just gradually wearing down, going into the educational system, battle after battle, on and on and on. And they will do this to every single country that they ever get within their web.
Look, I just have one piece of advice: save your kids, don't teach them English. No, I
You
mean,
know what?
I've come to the
It's a good
conclusion.
idea.
I've come to the conclusion that if I ever do end up as a married man with children, no, not a word of English will be uttered in my household. I can guarantee, except this dear program. Okay, that is the one exception I will make. But beyond this program, not a word of English will ever be uttered by any potential children I may have in the future. I can guarantee you that. But with that being said, speaking of Weasel Country, I guess we do have to move on to some news about Europe as
Mhm.
a whole. Which I mean, the term is it's very applicable to these sort of things. So I guess we can get right into it now. And although it pains me to give this designation to a country like this, now I wouldn't say it's necessarily this designation, but it's a very weasel move by a country like this. That Hungary has agreed to finish membership in NATO, as well as Turkey, which means there are no longer any dissenters to NATO expansion, at least for Finland. Now, Sweden's a different question. Sweden will likely come in later, but let's be realistic about this. It may
Mm.
sound like a cope. It's really not that big of a deal, in my opinion. It's a very symbolic, feel good move for NATO at this point. That Putler invaded Ukraine because they wanted to join NATO, but NATO expanded anyway. Look, Russia has another border with NATO, which fundamentally misses the problem of all of this.
Right.
While the Russians probably are not thrilled about another NATO state on their border, number one, Finland has been in cooperation with NATO ever since the end of the Cold War, ever since any Soviet backed influence at the end of the Cold War dissipated there. And they've been in cooperation with that. And while I'm sure they're not thrilled to have, say, Poland, Romania, etc., in NATO, it's fundamentally a different question than Ukraine or Belarus being in NATO, which are historically part of the Russian land, at least according to the Russian historical narrative, which I do tend to find more compelling than, say, the Ukrainian or otherwise historical narrative. So, while it may be a pain, although not much is going to change except formalization of what already existed, it's not the same as what is fundamentally a usurper state when it comes to the real "we was Rus" thing that comes out of Ukraine with their whole national identity, joining NATO right on Russia's borders, right in some of Russia's historical heartland, while they're trying to drive out any Russian speakers in that land. So, while the Baltic states, while all these countries being in NATO is an annoyance, it's not the same offense as, say, Ukraine or even Belarus being in NATO is. So, that's number one for our European news, where they're going to celebrate this as a great victory. They're going to bring out the dancing queen of Finland, Sanna Marin, and she's going to be very happy. She's going to throw another party over this and act like she's still 21 years old while she's pushing 40. I think she's that old. I don't know. But point being is the fundamentally unserious person, the kind of person could only run a country that is a protectorate of a larger empire. That let's not make any mistake here, is also as clownish, but at least has the guns to protect itself temporarily. Whereas the Finns don't. And Finland is also one of those countries that has a mythology around it. Now, this will go back to haha, the Russians are going to get another winter war, and they're going to harp on about this. And while admittedly Russian casualties were very high in the initial phase of the Winter War, the 1939 to 1940 part, and that can be due to the purges in the military, the reorganization. I can completely grant that. Number one, they still accomplished their goal of seizing the territory that they had wanted to claim from Finland. And number two, the continuation war happened. Although when the Germans had the initiative, it looked like the Finns were going to take their land back. But as soon as the initiative came in the Soviet favor, the Finns spent the next 50 years not as a Soviet republic, but they were under a neutral but leaning towards the Soviet regime. You can talk to Finns who were alive at the time. You can look at broadcasts at the time where their media was always skewed towards the Soviets. Sometimes they would play the Soviet sign-offs on the TV networks. Point being is, up until the end of the Cold War, while it still technically was a Western nation, it was far more under the Soviet sphere of influence. Not as much as, say, somewhere like Poland or Romania or Hungary might have been, but it was still there. So Finland lived in that shadow as a result of the Winter War, whereas they could have simply made like Sweden stayed neutral and not had any of that happen. If even they just accepted the territorial concessions that they had to make during the Winter War. And now they're pushed into the same position yet again, where they are going to saber rattle, they're going to grandstand because of their unusually high ability to deal casualties to the Russians, or to the Soviet Union more in particular, during the Winter War, that they're going to live on that mythology. Similar to the way that the Polish stand on the Polish Soviet War in 1920, that the fact that Leon Trotsky tried to have a little intervention into Poland that ultimately fell on its face and failed means that Poland is the great military power it was when it was the Commonwealth. So it creates this real delusion of grandeur. It creates this real exaggeration of historical
Yeah.
narratives. And they're going to harp on with that about Finland, even though ultimately nothing has changed except the fact that they need to formalize that Finland is in NATO. Now, that certainly isn't as much a sign of weakness as, say, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline or forcing European countries to dump their entire arsenal into Ukraine, but it is a bit of showing your hand when you do have to officiate Finland in NATO and probably Sweden soon afterwards. But ultimately, it doesn't really change anything because it's just a status quo. It's just a more open status quo, and it appeals to the people who the CNN watch the world, who think that, aha, the American Empire got, or I guess they wouldn't call the American Empire, but what we would call the American Empire, they just got another ally on their side against the next German mustache man out of
Against
Russia, against
Hitler.
Putler, and they're going to sit on their laurels. They're going to take that home to the bank. It's going to be a temporary morale boost as the situation in Ukraine starts to look more and more unfavorable.
Right, and also it's there not just for optics, but it's also there to continue to promulgate this ridiculous narrative set out by Washington that Ukraine and Finland, in relation to Russia, are just the same, and they're not. I mean, to a small degree, they will acknowledge the historical ties between Ukraine and Russia, but Ukraine rather, sorry, Finland does not have this, let's say, cultural sucking action, because one of the things that Western Ukrainians, and it is their ideology, which has become, again, it's another example of a well organized minority ruling a majority. It is the Western Ukrainian identity that has become the identity for Ukraine. Um, but that doesn't exist between Russia and Finland. Their languages are completely different. Um, they have far, far fewer historical ties. They're culturally far more different. Religion. There's no origins of Russians in Finland, which is not the case between the relation of Russians and Ukrainians. So one of the things that, for instance, Western Ukrainians bank on is if Ukraine goes this way because of the historical ties, because of the commonalities, and even blood relations between Ukrainians and Russians over so many centuries, they will change. Finland going NATO is not going to persuade Russia. Maybe, I mean, NATO, both Yeltsin and Putin asked to join NATO and they were refused. Obviously, that means NATO wants to bring war on Russia. That's what this whole thing is about, anyways. Um, so it, like, just to add another point to your point that you made, um, it's they're not the same. Western audiences, of course, the CNN crowd will perceive it as it is, that it is, uh, but it will have no influence on Russia in terms of culture. Now, the Finns have tried to awaken, Finnish minorities in Russia. But those people are Russian Orthodox. Many of them can't even speak Finnish at all anymore. They identify more as Russians, even though they create these like little flags that, oh, look, it has a cross leaning on its side, like the other Scandinavian countries.
But completely assimilated.
Yes, it's not going to have this effect. And unlike Estonia and Latvia, there are not sizable minorities of Russians living in Finland. So it's not going to have any of this effect. Even when and if Sweden becomes a member, it will have an even a more diminished effect. But you're right that, for these people, like America is this, I don't know, this geopolitical Disneyland dream weaver, right? Like America can give back all your glory. Trust us, it's going to happen. Um, so yeah, I would say I echo the points that you raised, and I just wanted to add that it doesn't have the same potential for a change in Russia, not even close to that of Ukraine.
Yeah, they're just it's a geopolitical gaslighting move that the Russians were going to invade Finland until big strong NATO stepped in and protected them from evil Putler. That's
Yeah,
entirely
I
what
mean
they're going for.
The Ukrainians even say that if Kiev goes to the west, Moscow will follow, right? Of course, that's not going to happen. What we're witnessing is a rupture of these two people for probably forever, definitely for a century. And Finland does not have anything like that. Protestant Finland is not going to have. It has no historical ties of any magnitude with Russia to even accomplish something like that. Regardless of the amount of Russians and Belarusians that have gone over to fight on Ukraine's side, it's not going to happen. And actually, there was a Belarusian that was killed. The report came out about a day or two ago. He was fighting in Bakhmut along with some Georgians. Um,
Well, all the
so
forces they mobilized for the Color Revolution had to go somewhere, so they
yeah, yeah.
found their fortune, or maybe in some cases misfortune, in Ukraine. And what I will say is, what not to get on too much of a side, and perhaps I should have said this in the Ukraine segment, but I think ultimately what this war has shown is an undoing of the Treaty of Pereslava, which, for those of you who don't know, is when the Ukrainian Cossack rebels in the Polish Commonwealth swore an oath of loyalty to the Tsar in order to become integrated into Russia. And I think what we're
Mhm.
seeing right now is a complete undoing of that. Now, of course, you can't base things on centuries old treaties and centuries old oaths taken to dynasties that haven't been in power in a century. But I think the symbolic and spiritual meaning of that is an undoing of it we're seeing play out in real time.
Yeah.
But moving on with our European news. So we have the Austrian parliament gave Zelensky a very warm welcome. And you had several deputies leave the parliament in order not to listen to his speech. Now, Austria has been a country that has been not pro Russia. Certainly, there's been no country in Europe that's been pro Russia except Belarus, but has been more on the anti Ukrainian side. Not quite as much as Hungary. I think Hungary is still the leader in that. But there have been these countries that we've gone over previously that are dissatisfied with the situation in Europe right now and are looking for alternative channels. That includes countries like Austria, Hungary, Serbia, even to a degree Croatia, Slovakia, etc., etc., etc. And sometimes you can throw Bulgaria in there, but these countries that look at the effects that this war is having on them and their people and realize that perhaps Ukraine having to cede some territory in the Donbass or wherever else is a more preferable option than our country's economies completely collapsing into irrelevance. Seeing as we're small nations already, we can't really afford the kind of blows that would be required to win this war. So we're going to turn over and we're going to not necessarily support the Russians, but we're not going to be party of this crusade that's ultimately doomed to end in at least us being sacrificed in its name. So you had the Austrian deputies walk out from Zelensky in parliament. So there is still a bit of the embers of dissent are still in Europe. So that's always good to see. Another interesting news out of that block of countries that isn't necessarily on board with the situation in Ukraine right now is Slovakia. Now, Slovakia has been one of these countries that for years has bounced back and forth. They've always maintained a much better relationship with Russia than other countries in their neighborhood. Think Poland, think the Baltic states, think its own neighbor and former partner in union, the Czech Republic. Need I say more? But Slovakia has been one of these countries, and as we said, they had recently sent MiGs to Ukraine, but they've also continued on with the cooperation and energy policy on economic issues, and that the party that is more amenable to Russia is leading in the polls right now in Slovakia in regards to their parliament system. But in the wider story of the U.S. accusing Russia of brokering an arms deal with North Korea in order to support their war effort, which may very well be true, but it is quite a funny thing to see that the Russians have to turn to North Korea when the Americans are doing the exact same, getting arms from South Korea to ship to Ukraine. So I guess this is just a massive Korean proxy war, is the real way we can look at it. But the U.S. has named uh, Slovakians as the brokers in a North Korea Russian arms deal. They didn't blame the Slovakian state, but they did blame a Slovakian national as the arms broker. And the U.S. Treasury had said that Ashot uh, Mirchev, who is a 56-year-old resident of Bratislava, was involved in the arms sale barter for North Korea to ship over 2 dozen kinds of weapons and munitions to Russia between late 2022 and 2023. In exchange, the Treasury said Pyongyang would obtain cash, commercial aircraft, commodities, and raw materials. Mirchev, forgive me, sir, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, and you're probably in the middle of a scandal that is far beyond you, and you're probably being whatever earnest work you did is probably being sacrificed. I doubt this man's another Victor Putin or anything, and not that Victor Putin was some horrible person who was, but you get the point. But Mirchev worked with officials from both sides to make the deals happen, according to the U.S. Treasury, but not say if any were completed or the details specific on the weapons involved. So goes on that last September that the White House accused Russia of buying artillery cells and rockets from North Korea, which North Korea denied, as well as Russia denied. Then in November, John Kirby, who is national security spokesman for the White House, said North Korea was shipping ammunition to Russia, but obfuscating the trade by making it look like it was being sent to the Middle East or North Africa. So you have this random Slovakian man being accused of brokering this arms deal between Russia and North Korea that wasn't even confirmed to have gone through. And as I said, Slovakia is one of these countries that has found itself in a very strange position where they aren't pro Russia, but they also aren't on board the war. I mean, there's even footage from before the war broke out of Slovakian MPs throwing water on Ukrainian visitors, and they were trying to raise
Mm-hmm.
the Ukrainian flag in the Slovakian parliament. They threw water and they hoisted the Slovakian flag. That was a very entertaining clip. And just to speak anecdotally, a Slovakian I know is the one who told me the quote I always like to repeat on the show. While people in that part of the world might not like the Russians, they certainly aren't willing to put their life on the line for the Ukrainians either. So it's the situation where I think they're accusing a non-state actor in order to put pressure on the state so that a country like this does enforce the same kind of anti-Russian hate speech laws that say Poland or the Czech Republic or any of these other countries do, that if you're shown to be too pro-Russia that you're going to get a knock on the door at 3 a.m. Which, once again, that's a fate that Slovakia has managed to avoid. And they're probably trying to push them in order to do something like that, saying like, well, oh, if your citizens can get away with that, perhaps you need to be more stringent on Russian espionage activity in your country, blah, 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 blah. So I think we all know what the score is here.
Yeah. I'm, I know there are huge swaths of the population who don't want this war, but their leadership is completely captured by the U.S. Um, and even though there's, as you mentioned, there's political opposition, um, and there was very good political opposition in Austria. Um, the longer this war drags out, the more that there will be side picking, and that will necessitate. Now in France, there was a woman who was recently arrested for apparently being pro-Russian or something, and
Yeah, and
uh,
also making comments about Macron as well. So
yes, yes, and there was a protester that was killed by the police this week in Paris. Um, they knocked him down, and he smashed his head on the road, on the pavement. And then they moved his body so it didn't look that way, as if like the coroners can't figure out like what happened, as if there's no video footage at a protest. It's hilarious. It's pathetic. But I like it's heartening to see. However, I don't hold out much hope. Um, I think the Americans are kind of looking at the math and they're thinking like we're running well over 31 trillion now. We're going to have to print more money. How are we going to pay for this? And I think the destruction of Russia is how they aim to pay for this.
which I would agree, but that is you can tell how desperate they are if they think that they need to completely go in and loot Russia in order to pay this off, that they have seen no other possibility. Because although they are not necessarily in favor of some sort of peaceful arrangement with Russia, the fact that they're willing to go to this lengths in order to loot the country shows that clearly it's their last opportunity in order to bring this back into balance, bring this budget situation back into it before it just completely falls through. But I would agree. But back to the news
Yeah.
of Europe and the current situation there. The Czech Republic, as we were just speaking about Slovakia, has said that it will aim to switch entirely to U.S. provided nuclear fuel by 2024, by next year. Now, what you need to understand about nuclear power in Europe, I've gone on about this before. While I can certainly give nuclear power the credit that it is due, that it's a very efficient and clean energy source, there's still a lot of utopianism about it. Number one, it doesn't solve the problem of the oil and natural gas needed to run an industrial economy. Number two, it isn't the key to energy independence that many think it is. That was a common criticism of Germany. Germany could have been energy independent, but they had to choose Russian oil and gas over nuclear power. Well, just to bring up some interesting figures, after Nigeria, in the year 2020, Russia was the largest exporter of uranium to the European Union. So the Russian nuclear sector still has a large sway on the European market. And that's on top of also materials needed to produce these plants, maintain these plants, etc., etc., on top of just the fuel itself. Russia has one of the largest uranium reserves in the world. And possibly we could see a color revolution in Kazakhstan in order to open up the even larger uranium reserves that Kazakhstan has. But while the U.S. is pretty comfortable, I think they're at either sixth or seventh nuclear fuel stockpile in the world. They certainly don't match Russia. I think Russia's at five, and then Kazakhstan's at four. I know Canada and Australia are up there, so there's at least other Western powers that the U.S. could buy from and then sell to the Czech Republic respectively, or those countries could sell to the Czech Republic, whatever. But with what you have with that, it is a trend that even the French have rejected at this point. Even, and well, I mean, of course, Hungary has. But there's a fundamental understanding by the pragmatists in Europe, and insofar as you want to consider the French pragmatists, that's a question that's up for heavy debate, in my opinion, that even the European nuclear sector is reliant on Russia. That fundamentally, no matter how you slice it, unless you want to pay 3 times more for American LNG and try to flip Kazakhstan into a pro European camp, that Russia is simply the most efficient energy source for Europe at this point. And
Mhm.
that goes back to the source of this war. They forced this war because the idea of even just an economically cooperative relationship between the Europeans and the Russians was unconscionable to the American Empire, whose goal is just complete domination. The reason they've driven themselves 31 trillion in debt in order to accomplish this, because America, it's a very naturally wealthy country, and it also has the power to throw around to the point where America should be a very economically healthy country. It should not be a country $31,000 in debt. 31,000, 31,000, $31 trillion in debt. Excuse me. And the reason it is that way is because, I mean, simply greed. As counterintuitive as it sounds, they've digging themselves into such a hole to think that they can dominate the world that what could have been a very wealthy and profitable system that had long term sustainability, they turned into what can only be described as the geopolitical equivalent of a Coke binge in order to get their rocks off quickly, and now they're dealing with the consequences of that, as you were alluding to earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the only way, because I mean, you look at some of these reports about, let's say, how long it will take for the US to refill its stockpiles that it's up until now delivered to Ukraine, and it's going to take, some of them will take over 5 years. The What I saw was 5 to 7 years, right? Um, Honestly, I don't. It could be that Biden is basically waiting till 2024 and see whether he gets reelected or not. I think this is something deeply personal for him. Um, he's always been an American supremacist.
Well, yeah, I just sent you that clip of him,
Yeah.
and that was at the time of the Kosovo War. And I'll try to remember the link this below. It was somebody had posted this on Twitter. Biden talking about how the Americans have a paternalistic role in Europe because before that, who was stopping the Europeans? The Europeans have always been warmongers, the British, the French, the Germans, blah blah blah. And that good thing we're finally here to stop the war in the Balkans because we have a duty to Europe and we have a duty to control Europe. And just this,
Oh, it was worse than that.
oh
He
yeah,
said we have an obligation to move the Euro pores toward a proper democratic civilization, right? The Europores. That's what he considers them. I like what academic agents said about Americans, is that they cannot accept that they're fundamentally not Europeans, right? When you scratch beneath the surface, especially like people on the right in America, I saw some horrible replies from Zero HP Lovecraft. Um, he's as big an idiot as Paul Fahrenheit. Um, I can't even describe the video that he's referring to. It's so grotesque. Now, a quote tweets this video on Twitter, and he says, "I'm sorry, world, semicolon America. This is America or whatever." And he says, "There's no Americans in this video." AA responds, "Cope." And then he responds like, "Oh, I can't hear you because of our total military, economic, and cultural dominance over you. Your vassalage is complete." Words to that effect. And I'm going like, what culture? Like, what culture? Like, you're claiming that in this video, which is grotesque, that these people in this video are not Americans. Um, but at the same time, you're saying that America has completely dominated British and European culture. Like, yeah, with those people that you don't consider Americans, right? Like, it's so absurd. He's not even capable of seeing the contradiction.
You know that
which
that
is
that
why I
reminds
have.
me of another
Mm,
story that came out this week. Now, I'm not going to cover too much on, let's just say, the shooting that happened this week, but I do want to talk a little bit about what Biden said in proximity to it. So
oh
there
God,
there
yes.
was an atrocious statement put out by the White House on Friday. So let me just get that here. So the official President of the United States POTUS account tweets. On Transgender Day of Visibility, we want you to know that we see you just as you are, made in the image of God and deserving of dignity, respect, and support. We will never stop working to create a world where you won't have to be brave just to be yourself. And then he also made another statement that they're part of the soul of America. I need to pull up that exact one too because I think it gets at something fundamentally deeper when it comes to the question of the American empire here. So his statement was oh, here it is. Uh, Biden says transgender Americans shape our national soul in an official proclamation. And look, I take absolutely no pleasure in saying this, but fundamentally he's right. These are the people who have become American culture, and really I will say this as somebody who is a uniquely North American creation who has my lots cast on both sides of this. Now, on my father's side, I have some very recent European ancestry, came over within the past century. My mother's side is a completely different story. They're founding stock Scots Irish who've been in Appalachia since before the foundation of this country. So I've always lived between two worlds when it comes to being able to view these questions. And I will say, my maternal ancestors, they up and left Scotland for Northern Ireland. They up and left Northern Ireland for America. And I would say just about anyone in the Anglosphere who is not a native soil to the British Isles, your heritage, your tradition is getting up and migrating when the situation becomes unbearable. There's no shame in it.
Hmm.
I'll just say that much. That your ancestors left just as bad, if not less contentious conditions in order to live their lives in a much more prosperous and fruitful way than what you did. And speaking about my own Scots Irish ancestry, they left the absolute hell that was Northern Ireland at the time in order to settle the Appalachian Mountains and at least attempt to build a new civilization there. While I do think there were some admirable feats, ultimately, when it comes to the history of America, they lost. I mean, just look at the Civil War itself. That's a I mean, look, you want to talk about when traditional America was lost? It was lost in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy. In my complete honest opinion. Um, so, look, I don't begrudge anyone for wanting to stay on the land that their ancestors have been on for centuries. I get it, but just keep in mind it's not shameful that your own ancestors also picked up and moved halfway across the world, and the situation just got unbearable for them. So, I'm not going to tell you to do one thing or another, but I'm just saying, although it may not be the most fun decision or the most cheerful decision to up and leave this place where your ancestors have been for centuries, it's certainly not out of tradition for them or for you for that matter.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, just today in Canada, we have news of uh, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau advocating uh, some kind of transgender show for children between 7 and 11. Like, this is it, right? Like, I'm sorry, but the elites decide what the culture is. You can go on and on about like that's not the real Canada or that's not the real America. I get it. I understand it, but it's them that determine it.
Yeah, but
And
well, I agree. And unless you have some sort of substantial pushback that actually can make a foothold, at the end of the day, you have nothing. What's the most you have? Ron DeSantis, who I think, don't get me wrong, all things considered, has done some decent work as governor of Florida, but I don't think he's going to lead a counterculture or something that can substantially push back against this. And I'm not saying that's even impossible, but that does not exist right now.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's disgusting what the White House has done, and especially that ridiculous spokeswoman. Um, I mean, what they're signaling to these people, right? Which is why they had like four little mini insurrections in 3 days across various state capitals, including Texas,
Those
based
are peaceful
Texas.
protests, laugh, you know.
Yeah, and these people literally look like freaks. They look dysgenic and degenerate, and they're complete freaks. And nothing about three 9-year-old kids killed by this wacko. Not at all. And what they're basically saying is look, we might have to kill you if you do this, but your cause is just. We will never empathize with the people that you victimized. Okay,
No,
so you have that assurance. It's not at all different than during the Floyd riots when Antifa and other protesters and BLM had the similar status. I'm beginning to wonder, like, I think, I said when this war started out that they would have to throw a few bones for the right. They would need white men to fight this war. I think there's a strong possibility. There's two strong possibilities right now because they are not throwing them any bones. Yes, I know they got rid of the vaccination for the coof in the military. I get it. Uh, but in every other front, they have only doubled down. And this shooting that took place in the Presbyterian Christian school um, it is, I think, a very clear sign of that they are not. And another example could be Meloni in Italy. They're not going to throw them any bones. They're not going to reduce immigration. They're not going to stop with trans kids and all the other LGBTQ stuff. Which makes me wonder: are do they think they have a base of people who would be willing to fight and die for NATO against Russia? Or have they decided that they really are not going to go in, and so there won't be a necessity to do such a thing? Um, be, because it's not so easy, I guess, to turn this thing off. Again, I think I will say it. I think I was mistaken. I thought there would be some pushback on some of this stuff, but frankly, after a year, I see very little evidence of it.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would say that yeah, for any one who I suppose would be consider themselves more of a traditional American, which I suppose to a degree I could consider myself something of the sort, being a particularly North American creature, as so to speak. But you're a second-class citizen in your own country, and uh, while I will never say anything is impossible, uh, as it stands now, you're a second-class citizen for the foreseeable future, and take that information to heart and do with it what you will. I really can't tell you how to live your life or how to organize anything, but I just want to try to be as honest about the situation as I possibly can. And yeah, I hope I'm proven wrong about a lot of what I say on this show, but as the time as it stands right now, I don't anticipate that.
Yeah. Um, I do have some, as long as we're doing European news, but
Yeah,
not,
go ahead, go ahead.
I have some news with regards to Russia, but not necessarily military news. And that is one of the maybe the first thing I'd like to lead with is the Gray Zone. I just watched this yesterday. They had a great episode that they did on the so-called Putin's hostages. These are the children, the thousands of children that were evacuated out of the Donbass and Zaporozhye regions of the new territories. We touched on this last week, but the interesting thing is, in a way, this has been debunked. it was the ICC, the International Criminal Court, decided to do this, but Yale's University Humanitarian Research Lab is the one that was responsible for an article that came out, and one of its members was on CNN, and or they're taking all these thousands of kids and indoctrinating them into Putlerism and so on and so on. And the fact of the matter is, and the Gray Zone did an excellent job in this, and that is that they interviewed these. Well, the children asked to be concealed because, as you remember, last year they assassinated Dugin's daughter, and so of course they have committed terrorist attacks on anybody who's considered a collaborator with the Russians. They killed people in Bucha. Remember, the UN has exonerated them. They have not found any evidence of genocide of Ukrainians, not just in Ukraine by Russians, but including Bucha. Um, so um, the long and the short of it is, of course, that these kids are in these camps in and around the Moscow area. The school that there's many of them, but the school that they focused on was a school for musicians. And first of all, these kids identify as Russian, and they speak Russian. Now, there are examples we pointed out in the last show that a father was reunited with one of these children, and they have since then moved to Latvia. Um, Russia is not obligated to ask Zelensky or Pravi Sector or Azov Battalion if they can do this, right? Um, just today, the Ukrainians have now said that they will forcefully remove children from Kramatorsk. Now, they know most of the people in Kramatorsk and Slavyansk are anti-Ukrainian regime. So again, it's projection. They know very well that the majority of people in Donbass voted to secede from Ukraine. It's literally like a UN right to do that if someone performs a coup on your country and deposes your leader, right? Like, you don't have to take global homo orders, right? You're not obligated just because it's America global homo. So um, so this was a very interesting case, but the way it ended was the same guy who was in the CNN interview. Um, I think he ended up answering a question about the gray zone piece and was asked, "Are the other schools like this one?" And he said, "Yeah, they're teddy bears," meaning like they're really soft, or there's not much of an indoctrination. Um, I mean, he's just contradicted himself, right? It's ridiculous. So that
Yeah,
was a
that's
very interesting piece. And the other bit of Russian news is the UN has now come out with like more evidence of torture of Russian POWs, and apparently 5 died with this electroshock therapy that they used on them. It's honestly, it's the same. I follow this war off and on since 2014. There's very little stuff that Ukraine does that surprises me.
yeah, I would have to agree with that as well. And yeah, once again, Putler, in the eyes of the LGBTQ CIA American Empire, is guilty for taking in refugee children who are not brown. That's really all this comes really all this comes down to at the end of the day. Now, just to briefly wrap up our European news, I just have a couple of other items I'll go through right here. So, to nobody's shock, the EU is entrenching itself into Moldova and Georgia by stepping up military aid to both. And this is also on top of the what could potentially be seen as the U.S. giving a green light to Azerbaijan to finally finish off the Armenian question. So that is something that will probably play out. Again, this is no shock. They're trying to really entrench the empire where it is. Protests in France continue. There was a climate neutral, quote unquote, referendum in Germany that was rejected by this. And farmers in several European countries from Poland, Slovakia, and let me just get the full list here. So, farmers in several European countries, including Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Slovakia, and Poland, have lost a collective 417 million euros, which comes out to about 451 million USD, over the flooding of markets with cheaper Ukrainian grain. So, once again, the European Union showing to be a completely counterintuitive organization that, as part of the economic protection market, you have Eastern European farmers having to compete with this outpour of Ukrainian grain that would have otherwise had passed through the Black Sea and gone elsewhere throughout the world, is being used once again to tank European economies, particularly the European cultural economy. And mind you, this is not the only way they do something like this. That the protest in the Netherlands, the farmers' protest in the Netherlands, was once again the quote unquote green activists trying to push draconian environmental regulations to destroy the Dutch livestock industry. And they've done this several places throughout Europe. They, for both European industry and agriculture, they come down like a hammer and they have no tolerance for any dissent about it, and they will flood the market with it. This organization that purported to protect domestic European industry has turned into the greatest enemy of European industry, which I'm sure shocks nobody.
Yes, I've seen that. I mean, they're undermining their own farmers. But just to touch back on two things, you mentioned Azerbaijan. This is very bizarre. So Faisal Mustafa is one of Azerbaijan's ministers. He's very pro-Israel, very anti-Iran. You know, there's a potential for a war between Iran and Azerbaijan, of course. Well, he was, I believe it was on the 29th, he was shot outside his house and he died of his wounds. Ironically, another Azerbaijani MP was in Tel Aviv at the Holocaust Memorial when this happened, or on the same date.
You can't make this stuff up.
Isn't it completely crazy?
Yes, and that's one
That
way of
just
putting it.
that just blows my mind. And I guess the other thing that was in the news that I missed was Evan Gershkovich. Um, he's he has a Slavic last name, but he's not really ethnically Slavic. He has lived in Russia for about 6 years. I don't know if he left recently and is returned. He's a journalist for the Wall Street Journal at the moment, and he was detained in Yekaterinburg. Um, Now, there's a huge Russian military complex there, and you know, was he spying? He could have. I don't know, and in some ways, I don't care. You remember when Dugina, Daria Dugina was assassinated, and they were interviewing like some of her relatives in Moscow, not Dugina's, but the assassins, the apparent assassins, right? Um, the BBC just like honestly, they just go around and just interview people in Russia. And I'm just thinking like, how serious are you guys about this? Like, are like major changes are going to happen for your state to survive. Like, um, as I said earlier, you know, France will arrest like a teacher that they think is pro-Russian. The Czech Republic has arrested people that they think are pro-Russian. And there was a poll that was just released that was arrested in 2015 for being considered to be pro-Russian. So this was long before the special military operation in 2022. So obviously not. They need to get more serious about this. I have no empathy for this guy Gershkovich. I'm quite certain he was um, trying to. Apparently, he was trying to figure out like people's opinions about Wagner. What do the average Russians think about Wagner? As if like this is really hard to figure out. And the only way I can know is if I go to like one of the biggest military industrial complex cities in Russia. Well, Shoigu might be there. It's these are just games. Uh, and it could be that he will be used as a pawn for release of a Russian that the Americans have detained or the British have
It's just
detained.
journalists acting like journalists. That's really all it is.
Yeah.
And seeing as the standard for an American prisoner swap is Brittany Griner, then
Mm,
the Russians probably have a pretty good bargaining chip in their hand in detaining a journalist who, as we all know, are the front line of freedom and democracy. But getting on to more significant European news, we have a European attempt to pivot towards China after the success of the Putin Xi
mm,
Jinping meeting. So, already you have Macron of France and Sanchez of Spain and other European Union leaders planning their own summits with China. Now, that may just seem like standard fare, something that you would expect in light of such a successful summit, that they want to keep the Chinese at least marginally in their corner, still have some sort of pro proactive diplomacy with them. But there is a bit more of a significant meeting here. And that is that France and China have agreed for an LNG trade, liquefied natural gas trade, using the Chinese yuan. So France, which is one of the major players in both the European Union and NATO, is also going through its own process of de-dollarization. Now, will it be as intense as many other parts of the world? No. Will they face some sort of backlash with this? Possibly. Will it be the same sort of backlash that, say, a smaller nation would face? Probably not. But France, even still, even after all of this, is still hedging its bets with the other pole of the world. And mind you, before this invasion started, Putin and Macron had a at least workable relationship between them as professional heads of state on several issues. And because the US is not in the same sort of tense relationship it is with China as it is Russia, now that may come someday in the very near future, they can get away with this. They can get away with making this deal. This is something the US is honestly just going to tolerate for the time being. And it does show something of an out for Europe. Now, will this be an out that they actually take? I don't know. But it does show that despite everything, despite the complete American hammer that came down on the continent over this past year, there are still avenues out. Now, once again, there's other countries that probably couldn't play this kind of game because they don't have the weight to throw around. But mind you, we just had that story a few weeks ago of Russian oil being switched from tanker in international waters and then put into Greece. So, while the pressure on Europe is nothing like it has ever been in the current world order, while Europe is under the most subjugation that it has been while the American Empire has been on the continent, arguably since, say, 1945, when it comes to the level, because 1945 still had the outright martial law military occupations of many parts of Europe, Germany, Italy in particular. But what we see now is a potential for Europe not to completely implode in on itself if it can maintain these sort of relationships with China. Because they've been severed from Russia. The American Empire made sure of that with the outbreak of this war. But they have not covered their base with China yet. Which, if anything, is probably going to accelerate the American Empire's advance towards some sort of confrontation, whether directly or indirectly with China. Perhaps provoke a China-Taiwan conflict so they can implement this same kind of sanctions packages that they've implemented so they can punish the Europeans for their dealings with China as they do with Russia. That could be on the
mhm.
horizon, but let the significance of this deal not be understated. That we have even a country that is ostensibly a loyal subject to the empire completely subverting the dollar system.
Yeah, I mean it's a very serious thing that's happening, and it has to happen because As to say, America's lost the mandate of heaven. It's over. Like it just has to die.
Oh, it's unbelievably over. And I would say that going back to the debate of traditional versus neo-American culture, I guess we could call it, it is already dead, but its zombie-like corpse just keeps trudging along. Just to put that caveat in there, and the fact that it is the zombie-like corpse honestly makes it all the worse because this is a country completely devoid of itself, of its identity, that has the entire world in the palm of its hand. So what do you think it's going to do to the rest of the world? Because even let's just say if this was the America of the 1950s that had hegemonic status, if American culture were to go back to that nifties 50s sort of thing, look, it wouldn't be the best thing in the world. It probably would still be a pretty maligned force in the world, but it wouldn't be the complete force of destruction that it is today. And the fact that we have this culturalist identityless blob that is still persevering years after its brain death and spiritual death, it makes it all the more dangerous. That's how you get somebody like Joe Biden saying the things that he does in front of Congress and having control of the red button. And that's why, honestly, uh, you could blame the entire Ukraine war on that if you want to go that far, which I I would.
Mhm.
But that is all I had for Europe. So if you have any last minute stories for Europe, we can certainly touch on those. If not, I have a bit of Middle Eastern news regarding, especially a lot of this Israel stuff.
Let me just check my notes. I have some Middle Eastern stuff, but I don't have any more European news.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
go right on to the Middle Eastern stuff. And would you like to take the reins on this?
Sure. So a few things that are developing. One of them is that normalization between Syria and Egypt has begun. This is pretty significant because Egypt is a major thoroughfare for shipping across the globe. Um, it is also seeking entry into BRICS, and I'm quite sure, if it hasn't already been mentioned, that it's also looking for, it's probably also interested in the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. It's now in the process of normalizing ties with Syria. Remember that Syria, Assad met with other Arab nations leaders in both the UAE as well as Saudi Arabia. So this normalization process and the acceptance of Syria is building, and a consensus is forming, and this is going to be very serious. And I think this, in many ways, is uh, going to create a possible clash with Israel. And again, it will be over Syria and potentially over Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. The reason I say that is I think it's like it doesn't matter whether we like Benjamin Netanyahu or not. He's not an ally, obviously. Um, Now he has struck down the law that they put in place to ban the gospel in Israel. But it goes further than that.
Yeah,
They don't
even
even want you to
Likud is
talk
not
about
that
it.
hard line. I mean,
Yeah,
just keep that in perspective. That even Likud realizes that hey, this has gone too far.
right. Uh, I mean, I guess the bottom line that I would like to say about Netanyahu is basically he represents a Jewish faction that believes Israel has to last, and that um, maybe for the first time ever, um, America is getting in the way of that. Now, you recall how much time it took for the Israelis to lend any kind of help to Ukraine. And that's when Bennett was in. And it's even more so the case with Netanyahu, right? Obviously, there's more cooperation than you're seeing on the news, but it's also obvious that that isn't enough for America. But I think that in and of itself is only the surface, because Israeli attacks on Syria have exponentially increased in the last 3 weeks. It is very constant now. There was an attack today, and the Syrians were able to shoot down. There is one unit of S-400s that were able to shoot down most of the missiles. The potential for a flare up in Saudi Arabia in order to drag the Russians into another front is high. But I think there's also confidence by the Syrians and the Iranians that that is actually doable, that they're willing to fight.
I mean, this is also an interesting tightrope that Netanyahu has to walk because traditionally he has kept at least workable relationships with Russia, even throughout the Syria conflict. That Netanyahu
Yeah,
and Putin have met several times, even at the worst and most tense part of the Syrian war. And
yeah. I think I think what Netanyahu understands is for Israel to survive, this is his point of view. For Israel to survive, it must make friends with Russia and China.
yes,
It has to it has to do it. It cannot afford. I mean, they have Bennett has said this as well, especially with respect to Syria, right? For China and Russia to align themselves ever more closely and integrate themselves economically, and that includes the military-industrial complex, more closely with Russia, right, is a clear sign to the Israelis that Russia expects better behavior out of the Israelis, right? What angers, I think, the U.S., including American Jews, is that that's a fundamental betrayal. But for him, for Netanyahu, of course, he is interested in preserving Israel. And I think he's seeing the signs that that um, may not happen by remaining um almost exclusively tied to America. That he will have to make moves. Israel has done this in the past before, and it may do it again. Uh, you know, will it betray America? I think probably because I think they're seeing certain machinations taking place. As I just said, very pro-Israeli. Sorry, very pro-Israel. Azerbaijani minister was assassinated outside his own house. That means he's being stalked, right? And this happens while another Azerbaijani minister is in Israel visiting the Holocaust memorial. Those are very clear signs about what is to be expected.
yes, and as you were speaking with Netanyahu and his position towards at least keeping a decent relationship with Russia and China, it does go back down to that Jewish factionalism again, where a lot of the, and let's face it, most of the powerful Jews that a lot of people talk about are American based. That's just the way it is. And
Yep.
they see more utility in the American empire insofar as their goals are concerned than the Zionist state. Now, Netanyahu, of course, he was born and raised in the U.S., but spent most of his adult life in Israel, is far more loyal to the Zionist state as a state itself rather than a means to an end. And I would honestly say that's to his credit, all things considered. And not often will I
It's
say
his
that.
legacy.
Yeah, not often will I say that about somebody like Netanyahu. So he can look at the situation. He can be far more pragmatic about this. Now, there is the policy of just constant antagonism towards things like Syria that do seem a bit counterintuitive to that, but we'll just put that aside for the time being. And realizes that because it's no longer a unipolar American world, because this is no longer the world of 2001, where the American empire will intervene with whatever force wherever it starts, then at the end of the day, it's going to be we're going to have to cooperate with other powers. Keep in mind, Israel's foundation was actually it was very much aligned with the Soviet Union when it was first founded. Now, that's not to say the Americans had no involvement at all, but keep in mind, the Soviet Union, first country to recognize Israel, and actually up until the Arab-Israeli wars of, I believe it was 67, is when the Soviet Union adopted an explicitly pro-Arab policy vis-a-vis Israel. But until that point, there was still a very cooperative relationship with the Soviet Union, as it were. And so this isn't the first time we've seen these sort of shifts. And Netanyahu, as you said, is dedicated to keeping this project alive for his own personal legacy and for his own personal sentimentality, as well as his belief in the interests of his people. And once again, that's not to heap any kind of praise on Netanyahu. As far as I'm concerned, Israel can blow off the map, but that's aside the point. But ultimately, you have coming out of the White House people who place the value of the American empire over that of the Zionist state, which, I mean, you could argue that was the reason Trump got elected. You could argue that's the reason they put Trump in power, is because he was far more in line with that than he was with the other side. And really, I would say that's a pretty reasonable thing. I mean, remember, on top of the entire Michael Flynn thing, how they got him for his illicit phone call to the Russian ambassador, he was trying to arrange a peace agreement, or an understanding at least, between the U.S. and Russia for the benefit of Israel through Turkey. He had this entire worldview that, of course, the U.S. and Russia had to put it to bed because we have to confront the Islamic civilization, as he would have put it. A very Bush-era idea, but approached in a far more pragmatic way than, say, somebody like Bush or his neoconservative friends would have. And that's not to defend the idea, but I will say this: it was quite an interesting throwback to have somebody like that talking like that in 2017. But I mean, ultimately, when it comes to this, you have Biden on top of this. I guess you could call it a cover revolution in Israel. I'm hesitant to use that term, but I can't really think of anything better. And what's also interesting about this is you have the strikes in Syria, but Netanyahu also has sacked his defense minister, and talks of a potential strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, whether that be by the U.S. alone, by Israel alone, or as a joint strike, have completely dissipated in light of these protests. And Biden says he will not invite Netanyahu to the White House until this judicial bill is solved. And the entire basis behind this judicial bill is pretty much Netanyahu is trying to save his own tail after his, let's just say, corrupt actions in office. And you know the meaning of corruption. It really is. When my guys do it, it's being efficient government. When the other guys do it, it's corruption. Blah blah blah. And being as somebody with no real dog in an internal Israeli fight, I have to say the corruption charges are probably the same kind of ones they levy against Eastern European countries, where it's the quote unquote wrong kind of corruption, or whether it's not officiated, or whatever else it may be. So I think Israel is probably in. There are actually other. I've heard other people echo this sentiment that Israel is in the weakest state it has been since the 1973 war, and I really don't see any way around that. And especially as the American empire continues the purity spiral, continues to clamp down on its quote unquote allies abroad, Israel could very well be caught up in that, because there are certainly a state very much linked to the American backing of force, especially as the Middle Eastern powers of the region, such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, start to come to an agreement where they can't be played against each other anymore with the direction things are going. As Egypt is coming to terms with Syria, and as Egypt is coming into the more Russian aligned worldview, the more Russian Chinese aligned power block, with them signing on to the BRICS Bank and trying to join these other organizations, as well as, like I said, all the other major Middle Eastern powers for the time being, that Israel finds itself in a very isolated position at the end of the day. And really, they also don't have the luxury of breaking away from the American empire, because as much Zionist influence as there is in the U.S. government, I'm not going to say it's a proportional way anyway, but let's just say the Americans have a few fail safes if Israel would ever flip on them. And especially as Zionistic feelings among the Jewish diaspora in America continue to decrease, it's all the more likely that those switches will be pulled, because there's several people that could phone up Biden or whoever and say that, well, yeah, sure, we would have liked to see this project succeed, but it's not ultimately. We can sacrifice it if our interests need be. So sorry, Netanyahu. Sorry, Likudnik. Sorry, whoever. And to the point where, while I'm not denying Zionist influence, while I'm not denying what it has been historically, I'm just going to say once again, it's not what it was in the 1990s. It's not what it was in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so I think he sees a fundamental change happening in the world. and he wants to prepare Israel for it. Like, I agree with you how he's going to do this, especially considering how much funding Israel depends upon from the U.S. Is going to be very interesting to watch. No doubt he's going to try to play both sides because Israel cannot exist without the tremendous backing that America provides for it. Um, I just also, this whole judicial question. Um, just to be absolutely fair, what Netanyahu is trying to achieve is literally a more democratic Supreme Court. Um, it like if it was any other country, just value-free judgment, um, it would be, I think, a good gesture. That you would want a leader to do that, because Israel, like many other Western countries, is captured by a Supreme Court that determines where the culture is going, and it is this that has angered them. There are some preliminary reports that are indicating support by Soros. I think this is a color revolution, and I think the Biden administration wants him gone. They want him out of there. Now he is, I for now successfully fought it off. Um, and like I say, you remember how long it took Bennett to finally give 155 millimeter shell rounds um, to Ukraine, right? Because Israel is wondering, like, will it go to war? There was a skirmish a few weeks ago between them and Lebanon. Though I think it was actually the Lebanese forces rather than Hezbollah. I'm not 100% on that. Obviously, it's blown over. There were no casualties. Nonetheless, um, you know, Israel is always going to be in a precarious place. That is its destiny, and we shall see what will happen.
To put it in polite terms, as the very, let's just say, theological Zionist from the boomer Protestant milieu go the way of the dinosaur, I mean, they're the main basis for political support in America from Israel, even more than the Jewish diaspora at this point. And it does make
Mm,
you wonder over the next decade, as, like I said, to put it in polite terms, as they go the way of the dinosaur, how that affects support for Israel. Because across all groups, is either anti-Israel sentiment growing or just complete apathy towards the situation. And I mean, you can see why they have to realign now. And unless they do embrace the complete rainbow coalition culture, at the end of the day, they're either going to have to find some way to navigate the Middle East under a Russian Chinese framework, most likely, or they're going to have to go full Samson option. And I actually don't see either of those happening. And the question is, are some of the outlandish predictions about the end of Israel actually going to come true? And also, that does make me wonder if this does happen sooner rather than later. How does that call into question a lot of the American political and religious mythology that has been built around Israel? And
yeah.
I think that would be quite interesting. You notice that a lot of those kind of people and a lot of the people peddling that have moved away from it because, once again, when you base these eschatological prophecies on something so concrete and so earthly, it's just not going to pan out. And
Mhm.
something like that is going to happen. And it's actually interesting because I was going back through the archives and I found one of these people giving a talk about this kind of stuff from I think it was around 2010, 2011, and pretty much like all the predictions they had for the course of the Middle East that they were trying to base on so-called biblical prophecy, none of them came to fruition. But I think it calls an interesting question that since they've been such an outsized voice in American foreign policy, particularly towards the Middle East, for the past 30 years, what's going to happen when they're either gone or things go complete in the complete opposite direction than what they would have expected?
Yeah.
And I'll just round out some of the Middle Eastern news before getting into some of the last news we have about the U.S. with the whole Trump indictment and arrest, alleged upcoming arrest, and some of the stuff about the Restrict Act and the Douglas Mackey case. So, just out of the Middle East further, you have Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen meeting with the Azeri Foreign Minister to establish a quote unquote common front against Iran and strengthen bilateral cooperation in the fields of economy, security, energy, and innovation. And that's already on top of the very strange assassinations and the stabbings that you had mentioned before, so that creates an interesting dynamic. And then the last major piece of news we have out of the Middle East is that Saudi Arabia is set to join the SCO, and also it has made a major deal. Saudi Aramco has made a $12 billion plus deal in oil refinery with China as well. So as China continues to broker peace and as the region does tend to become more stabilized under what is now a particularly Chinese led effort, you have the growth of the Saudi energy industry and the economy at a time when, once again, the Americans have completely shut themselves out of the energy market on top of forcing Europeans to pay extreme premiums for just absurd reasons at that point. And it's a country that looked like it was going to budgetarily implode in 2014, 2015 has been restabilized just by the complete incompetence of the American empire, and it's really quite a sight to behold.
Yeah.
And with that being said, we will move on briefly to some of the news out of the US. So, it finally came down. There has finally been a Trump arrest warrant issued. And with that, what they had ultimately decided to get him on was the hush money he allegedly paid for his affair with, let's just say, Lady of the Evening on camera, Stormy Daniels. And this is really the best that they can pull. And this is the first time that a former U.S. president has ever been issued an arrest warrant. Now, Trump is currently in Florida, and this warrant was issued by a jury out of Manhattan in New York City, in the state of New York, of course. So, it's speculated whether Trump will be extradited to face this or whether he's going to go turn himself in and actually fight the legal battle himself. There's some speculation coming from Trump's team, and now this could just be hot air, that he's expected to go face the music on Tuesday and that his attorneys have advised him to do so. So far, since this announcement at the end of the week, last week on, I believe it was either Thursday or Friday, his legal campaign has raised about $5 million in funds, and we all know why they're doing this. Nobody expects Trump to go to jail for money that he paid to a woman of ill repute, 15, 20 years ago at this point. Because Trump is Trump. Trump is, let's just say, leads a more bohemian lifestyle. So when those kind of things happen, nobody's really shocked. And I'm sure this is not the only case he's ever done something like this. He's probably had other high profile affairs that he's quieted up with money. And I mean, look, I'm not going to morally condone that, but just that's what those kind of class people do. The New York billionaire is sleazy. I would have never guessed, and I guess we're going to try to imprison him on this because he had an interesting political career, let's put it that way. I mean, but ultimately, they're going to drag him through the courts. They're going to make him campaigning so untenable. They're going to make it into such a pain that he won't be able to win. That he'll be constantly mired within legal troubles, and perhaps because of some mandated court appearances, he won't be able to campaign on the 2024 campaign
Mm.
trail. And while I don't think they see Trump as that much of a threat, they see his presence as an avatar for the people he represents as a threat, in which they cannot allow. They already allowed that once, they made that mistake once, and they're not intent on making that mistake again. And even somebody like the aforementioned Ron DeSantis, who, like I said, I don't have much hope for, if any, I could even see them trying to pull something similar on that. I mean, I know a lot of people think that he's the preferred controlled opposition candidate, but even he goes a little bit too much against the grain. Now, I'm not saying he's some sort of a great revolutionary figure or somebody who's on our side by any means, but he still does represent the same base of people Trump does. And even he has said that uh, this is a completely politicized arrest, that he wouldn't follow through with a warrant. He's not going to extradite him from Florida. So there's that. And I mean, he has to say that to save his own skin because being the Republican candidate that threw Trump under the bus for your own political gain is going to just completely destroy his political career. There's no way he could get away with that because despite the constant bickering and back and forth from political camps that no, Trump is better, no, DeSantis is better. When you look at the average American right winger, they have a pretty positive opinion of both, and that they would be pretty satisfied with both running. Now they may have their preferences, but the either or division is more of a symptom of people who are very much knee deep into this sort of swamp. But otherwise, again, nobody's going to support DeSantis if he goes along with the uh, Trump nonsense, which I don't think he will. And perhaps he's just kicking the can down the road until maybe the Supreme Court or some higher authority forces in some sort of extradition. Perhaps there'll be a federal arrest warrant for Trump. I doubt that. I think what we're looking at right now is they want to bog down the man in legal issues so he can't be the at least the on the surface representation of the people that they hate and are trying to snuff out the last remnants of.
Yeah, I completely concur with you. I from what I've read and listened to so far, um, it's I think very doubtful that they're going to convict him. Remember, they tried to impeach him twice, once even after he was no longer president. There's a lot of things that about this case don't quite make sense. As far as I know, I believe it was this lawyer Cohen that did the paying. I don't know
Hey,
why
there's that
this
name again.
time. Yeah, I don't know why this time it would stick. Um, but I agree with you. This is strategic. It's to stop him from running, and I think they're convinced that this if they stop him this one last time, they'll never have to see him again, and everything after that is in the bag.
Yes, and getting on to further political persecutions, just to show that this isn't necessarily about Trump, this is more so about what he represents. Douglas Mackey, better known as Ricky Vaughn, infamous 2016 pro Trump poster. I think he pulled something like 57,000 followers back in the day, which was pretty good by 2016 numbers. Back when you could get actual significant engagement on Twitter, nonetheless. And he was indicted for something ridiculous along the lines of interfering. Well, he was actually convicted of quote unquote interfering with the conspiracy to interfere with the exercise of somebody's rights, which defines two or more people get together to try to supplant somebody's rights. And what they tried to get him for is the most basic meme that has been made in every election since, I don't know when. The two they really the main one they focused on, the other one they focused on were the main one was, hey, did you know you could vote by text? Did you know that Democrats can vote by text? Once again, a very run of the mill joke that would be made in any election cycle that's been made several election cycles before. And then the old joke, hey, Democrats vote on Tuesday, Republicans. Oh, yeah, Republicans vote on Tuesday, Democrats vote on Wednesday. Stuff like that. Just very trivial jokes. And of course, this got a lot of engagement, and they had to completely throw him under the bus for this. This trial has been going on for a while. Keep in mind, this was not a civil case. This was a criminal case that they got some New York DA to pick up on, and they got some New York jury to convict this guy on. Now, given how high profile and contentious this case is, it is likely going to be something that is appealed, and I don't know, maybe this is something because of the nature of it could get all the way to the Supreme Court, in which case that holds a lot of other questions as well. But ultimately, if your meme gets too popular, you're liable for any Soros-funded, ideologically driven district attorney out of New York or wherever to throw some charges at you, get you in a kangaroo court, get a jury against you, and even if they don't convict you, they can still make your life miserable. They can still drain you of your time and your money fighting court battles until you capitulate to them. And then I would move on right here to the last major story I do have for the show is Senate Bill 686, otherwise known as the Restrict Act. And this is a bill that would carry a maximum 20-year sentence for using a VPN operated by a quote unquote foreign adversary, in which case, this is how loosely defined foreign adversary is. So I will pull up this document right here for the Restrict Act because this is one of the most draconian pieces of legislation to come out, frankly, the Western world, even worse than some of the British hate speech laws, even worse than some of the Canadian hate speech laws, worse than the Anglosphere in general. And America has traditionally been the last holdout of the Anglosphere when it comes to avoiding completely draconian measures, but it looks like while it was delayed, it's going to hit so much harder than what other countries have been put through. So, just to read the countries consider that. So it could be considered from the People's Republic of China, including Hong Kong and Macau administrative regions, the Republic of Cuba, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, the Russian Federation, and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and the regime of Nicolas Maduro in particular. And it would be more draconian than even what the European Union has. I was actually talking to somebody who lives in Germany who was describing this that the worst they throw up is a firewall, and they'll punish the people who promulgate this material, but they won't punish the people who access it. And that this would be a case that would actually punish the people seeking to access this information, even using a VPN, practically opening the door for the banning of VPNs, which, on top of being able to access, let's just say, less than uh, regime proof content, also allows you to protect your self. And look, this would be the great place for a VPN plug if I had any sponsors here, but that's aside the point. But it allows you to just, as all the ads say, to have a more private and protected internet experience because there are so many scams out there. There's so many malicious actors out there that you really do need some sort of cyber protection. I would recommend everyone get one, even if it's just a very cheap one or a free trial one, certainly. But they want to completely shut down any regard of any sort of discourse with the internet. Now, I know I have been on the record as denouncing liberal principles, and I still do. But one thing I've always maintained to, and perhaps this is too much of a liberal or libertarian prior, is that I do think a bit of open speech is a nice release valve. I do think that even in a more, let's just say, authoritarian society, maybe even a society I would desire, that having some sort of release valve where people can just kvetch about things online, as I'm doing right now, is a preferable alternative to as if they couldn't. And if you want to put this in perspective, if the Restrict Act were to pass, and this may sound like an exaggeration, but I promise you it's not, Russia and Belarus would have more of free speech and free discourse than the Americans would have. Because at that point, I mean, you can still access American news websites in Russia for some reason. I don't know how that has happened, but still, uh, European Union has IP blocked RT, so you'd need a VPN to access that. And like I said, even European Union countries won't punish you for that. But this is talking about punishing you for accessing the material via a VPN. So if this were to go through, RT were to get banned, you decide I want to read what's on RT, you fire up your VPN. If you get caught doing that, they can put you in for up to 20 years. Now, that's assuming this act passes in full force and that it holds up to court scrutiny. Perhaps they've overplayed their hand here. Reading this, I think they might have, but I think there's a very real chance that a significant portion of this act actually does go through and affects our lives. In which case, this is one of the things that I am most pessimistic about, just out of all the news stories in general.
Right. And I completely agree with you. I don't think this is something to take lightly, even as you indicated that it could be taken in piecemeal. Um, because obviously what we're seeing is the narrative is evolving in the worst possible way we could imagine. And uh, whatever they don't accomplish this time, they could very well accomplish a few years down the road. America is committed to this ideology. It To me, it looks like it is the ideology that's the hill it will die on.
Yes, and they've hitched their wagons in this. They really have no out to it, so at that point, it's really there's nothing they can really do with that. So I can't really put that into any better perspective than you did, and they are going to sink this entire ship for it. And I will say, I've made a lot of empty threats of emigration before, but I will say that if this actually goes through, I would rather emigrate to somewhere in Europe or wherever and deal with their, at that point, what would seem like minor speech codes than have to put up with the Restrict Act. So, because
Mm.
there's a very real possibility that this program I'm doing right here, now I've known I've exaggerated in the past, would get me into legal trouble if I continued this show under an America where the Restrict Act is in full force.
Yeah.
But that's all I had for this episode of the War Report. If you have any last minute items, certainly now would be the time.
No, I don't actually this time around.
Well, excellent. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.